Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The van died right as I was passing the old Packard plant ruins, that stretch of Concord Street, where even the cops don't bother patrolling anymore. I'd been making deliveries for Fresh Direct since my 31st birthday 3 months earlier. Needed something steady after the divorce papers got finalized. Detroit in August feels like breathing through a wet towel most nights, but when every streetlight went dead at exactly 9:47, the humidity somehow got worse. The whole city just stopped. No warning, no flicker, just instant black. I actually laughed at first, sitting there in my busted van, thinking it was just my luck to have the alternator crap out the same moment a transformer blew somewhere. But then I stuck my head out the window and saw it wasn't just my block. Every building, every traffic light, every neon sign, dead. The only light came from a few cars still running, their headlights cutting through the dark like searchlights in a prison yard. I tried calling dispatch, but my phone had no signal, not even emergency service. The radio in the van was dead static on every channel. After 20 minutes of trying to get the engine to turn over, I finally gave up and grabbed my backpack from behind the seat. Home was maybe 4 miles northwest, straight through Brush Park and past the old Tiger Stadium site. On a normal night, it would have been an annoying but doable walk. But standing there on that empty street with the Packard plant looming like some massive corpse behind me, I felt this weird pressure in my chest. The darkness wasn't just dark, it was thick, almost solid. Without the constant background hum of the city, every sound seemed amplified. My footsteps echoed off the abandoned buildings, each one bouncing back at me from different angles. That's when I heard it for the first time. An engine idling somewhere behind me, maybe 2 blocks back. No headlights, just the low rumble of a V8, patient and steady. I picked up my pace heading west on Hendry Street, telling myself it was just another driver lost in the blackout. But the engine followed, maintaining that same distance, never getting closer, but never falling behind. When I turned north onto Russell, the sound disappeared completely. For maybe 30 seconds, I thought I'd been paranoid over nothing. Then I saw it, a dark shape rolling through the intersection I'd just crossed, engine off, coasting silent. The car was using momentum to follow me without making noise. My mouth went dry as sand. Nobody does that unless they don't want you to know they're there. I started jogging, not quite running, but moving fast enough that my delivery uniform stuck to my back with sweat. The engine started up again, louder now, more aggressive. When I cut through an alley between 2 warehouses, the car actually accelerated, tires squealing as it took the corner hard to circle around the block. I came out the other end of the alley onto Saint Antoine and immediately ducked behind a dumpster. The smell hit me like a physical wall, rotting food mixed with something chemical, but I pressed myself against the brick wall and waited. The car rolled past slow, windows down, and for the first time I got a decent look at it in the dim moonlight. It was an old Crown Victoria, the kind cops used to drive before they switched to SUVs, painted that flat primer gray that seems to swallow light. The driver was just a shadow, but I could see him turning his head back and forth, scanning the empty sidewalks. Then he stopped right in front of the alley entrance, engine ticking as it cooled. He knew I was close. I could hear him breathing through the open window, these deep, deliberate breaths like he was trying to smell me out. My legs started cramping from crouching, but I didn't dare move. After what felt like hours but was probably 2 minutes, he revved the engine once, a warning or a promise, and continued down the street. The smart move would have been to stay hidden until dawn, but I needed to get home. My insulin was in the fridge and I'd already missed my evening dose. Without it, things would get bad fast. The shakes, the confusion, then worse. So I waited another 5 minutes before creeping out from behind the dumpster. The streets were tomb quiet except for distant car alarms that had been triggered when the power died. Their batteries slowly dying too, each alarm getting weaker and more distorted. I stuck to the shadows, moving from doorway to doorway like I'd seen in movies. feeling ridiculous but too scared to walk in the open. At Forest Avenue, I found an abandoned convenience store with its security gate half raised. The owner must have been closing when the blackout hit. I slipped inside, hoping to find a working phone or maybe just catch my breath. The store had been picked clean already. Shadows moved in the back, probably looters, but they scattered when they heard me. On the counter, someone had left a half-eaten sandwich and a warm beer. My stomach cramped from hunger, but I couldn't risk stopping to eat. Through the store's front window, I watched the street for any sign of the Crown Vic. Nothing for 10 minutes, then 15. I was about to leave when I noticed something that made my knees weak. Across the street, barely visible in the darkness, was another car. A beat-up Chrysler 300 with tinted windows. It had been there the whole time, just sitting, waiting. As I watched, the driver's door opened and someone stepped out. Even in the dark, I could tell it was a woman, tall and thin, wearing what looked like medical scrubs. She walked to the middle of the street and just stood there, head tilted up like she was listening for something. Then she raised her hand and made a circular motion in the air. Within seconds, I heard engines starting up all around the block. Not just one or two, at least 5 different vehicles, all coming to life at once. They'd been sitting dark this whole time, surrounding the store, waiting for her signal. The woman got back in her car and all the engines started moving, converging on the store from different directions. I bolted through the back exit into a loading dock area that stank of spoiled milk and diesel fuel. Behind the store was a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, but someone had cut a hole near the bottom months ago. I squeezed through, tearing my uniform shirt on the twisted metal, and found myself in the parking lot of an old body shop. Broken windshields crunched under my feet as I ran between the skeletal remains of stripped cars. Behind me, I heard car doors slamming and voices. Calm, organized voices giving directions like they were coordinating a search grid. These weren't random criminals taking advantage of the blackout. This was something else, something planned. I made it to Gratiot Avenue and had to make a choice. Take the main road where I could move faster, but be completely exposed, or stick to the side streets and risk getting cornered. That's when I saw it. The people mover track overhead, its rails disappearing into the darkness. The automated trains wouldn't be running without power, but the emergency walkways alongside the tracks would still be there. If I could get up there, no car could follow. The nearest station entrance was 3 blocks north at Cadillac Square. I ran flat out, no longer caring about noise, my work boots slapping against the pavement in a rhythm that seemed to echo forever in the dead city. Behind me, engines roared as the cars spread out, trying to cut off my escape routes. At Broadway, one of them, a black Escalade with a cracked windshield, came screaming around the corner, tires smoking. The driver tried to clip me, but I dove between 2 parked cars just as the SUV's mirror exploded against a parking meter. The impact spun the Escalade sideways, and it slammed into a storefront, glass cascading across the sidewalk like ice. But I could already hear another engine coming from the opposite direction. They were herding me, pushing me toward something. The Cadillac Square station loomed ahead, its entrance a black mouth in the side of the building. The electronic turnstiles were dead, frozen in the open position. I vaulted over them and took the stairs 3 at a time, my chest burning, legs starting to shake from the adrenaline and lack of insulin. The platform was pitch black except for the emergency exit signs running on battery backup, their green glow barely reaching past the yellow safety strip. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, cursing when I remembered the battery had died. The maintenance walkway was behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The lock had been broken years ago, according to every Urban Explorer video I'd ever watched about Detroit. Sure enough, it swung open with a rusty shriek. The walkway was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, with a rusted railing on one side and nothing but a 20-foot drop to the street on the other. Old cables and pipes ran along the wall, covered in decades of pigeon droppings and diesel exhaust residue. I started moving carefully along the track, testing each step on the metal grating. Below, I could hear the cars circling the station like sharks, engines revving. They knew where I'd gone. Flashlight beams suddenly blazed up from the street, sweeping across the underside of the track. They were getting out of their cars, looking for a way up. About 100 yards down the track, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps on the metal walkway behind me, moving fast and confident like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going in the dark. I tried to speed up, but the grating was slick with oil and bird droppings. My foot slipped and I went down hard on one knee, the impact rattling the whole section of walkway. The footsteps behind me stopped, then started again, faster now. Up ahead, I could make out the next station platform in the dim green glow of its exit signs. But as I got closer, I saw shadows moving on the platform, at least 3 people waiting for me. They'd sent someone ahead to cut me off. The walkway curved around a support pillar, and for a moment I was hidden from both the platform and whoever was behind me. That's when I noticed it. A maintenance ladder bolted to the pillar, leading down to what looked like an old utility tunnel entrance. The rungs were thick with rust and bird mess, but it was either that or get trapped between 2 groups. I swung myself over the railing and started climbing down, trying not to think about the last time these bolts had been inspected. The ladder ended at a concrete ledge barely wide enough to stand on. The utility tunnel entrance was sealed with a steel grate, but the bottom corner had been pried open, probably by copper thieves. I squeezed through into absolute darkness that smelled like stagnant water and dead rats. Using the wall to guide myself, I moved deeper into the tunnel, my breathing loud in the confined space. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, some kind of old switching station from when the people mover was built. Weak light filtered through ventilation grates in the ceiling, just enough to see the shapes of old electrical panels and rusted equipment. I heard voices echoing down the tunnel behind me, then the scrape of someone forcing themselves through the grate. But there was another sound too, water running somewhere close by. Following the sound, I found a drainage pipe, maybe 4 feet in diameter with a steady stream of water flowing through it. The pipe led toward what I hoped was the river. It would be nasty, probably full of sewage overflow, but it might get me out of this trap. I was about to climb in when my vision started to blur. The lack of insulin was catching up fast. My hands were trembling now, not from fear but from my blood sugar crashing. The drainage pipe was my only option. I dropped into the lukewarm water that came up to my knees, gagging at the smell of sewage and chemicals. Moving bent over in the pipe made my back scream, but I pushed forward, one hand on the slimy wall for balance. Behind me, I heard splashing. They'd found the pipe and were following. The water got deeper as the pipe angled down, rising to my waist, then my chest. Just when I thought I'd have to turn back or drown, I saw light ahead, real light, not the green glow of exit signs. The pipe opened onto a concrete canal that I recognized as the DeQuindra Cut, the old rail line converted to a greenway. I pulled myself out, soaked and reeking, my whole body shaking now from the blood sugar crash. I needed to get home, get insulin, or I'd pass out soon. But standing at the edge of the canal, flashlights cutting through the darkness behind them, were 2 more of them. A heavy-set man in a security guard uniform and a younger guy wearing a FedEx shirt. They'd been waiting here the whole time, knowing exactly where the pipe led. The security guard spoke into a radio. "We got him at the cut. Bring the van." That's when I understood. They weren't trying to catch me. They were wearing me down, exhausting me, waiting for me to collapse on my own. The FedEx guy started walking toward me, hands up like he was trying to calm a spooked animal. "Just relax, man. You're gonna pass out in about 5 minutes anyway. We've been watching you for weeks. We know about your condition, your insulin schedule, everything. Should have taken your evening dose at 8, right? It's almost midnight now." My legs gave out and I dropped to my knees on the concrete. Through my blurred vision, I saw the woman in scrubs walking down the embankment carrying a medical bag. She knelt beside me and I felt the sharp prick of a needle in my arm. Not insulin. Something that made my muscles go slack immediately. As she worked, she spoke in this conversational tone like we were old friends. "You delivered to the wrong house 3 weeks ago. Remember that package for Riverside Drive? The one you left at the blue house instead of the gray one? Our client was very unhappy about that delay. The package contained something time-sensitive, something that degraded because of your mistake." She pulled out another syringe, this one filled with clear liquid. This is insulin. We're not monsters. But our client wants you to understand that mistakes have consequences, that someone is always watching, always keeping track. I woke up in my apartment 2 days later, according to my phone. My insulin kit was sitting on the kitchen counter with a note. Next time, double-check the address. The power was back on, the city humming with its usual noise. I called the police, but what was I going to tell them? That a group of people in regular clothes hunted me through the city during a blackout because of a misdelivered package? They found no evidence. The cars, the people, even the woman in scrubs were ghosts. Fresh Direct said I never showed up for my shift that night, that I'd called in sick. The security footage from every camera along my route showed nothing but darkness from the blackout. I quit the job that day, moved in with my sister in Grand Rapids the next week. Sometimes I Google that address on Riverside Drive, trying to figure out what could have been in that package, what could have been worth all that. But mostly I just try not to think about how many other delivery drivers are out there, making innocent mistakes, not knowing that someone is keeping score, not knowing that the next blackout might be for them. The heat in Arlington that July was suffocating, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin the second you step outside. I'd just gotten home from my shift at the hospital, 12 hours in the ER dealing with heat stroke cases and dehydration. All I wanted was a cold shower and to collapse in front of the AC with leftover Chinese takeout. My daughter Kayla was spending the week with her dad in Houston, so I had the whole house to myself for once. The divorce papers had my birth year right there in black and white, 1987, and somehow seeing it made everything feel more final. I remember thinking how quiet the neighborhood was that evening, everyone probably hiding inside from the heat. Our street, Willow Creek Drive, usually had kids playing until dark, but that day even they'd given up. I kicked off my scrubs in the laundry room and was heading upstairs when everything went dark. At first I thought maybe I'd blown a fuse running too many things at once. The AC was cranked, I had the washing machine going, the TV was still on. But when I looked out the window, the entire street was pitch black. Not a single porch light, no glow from anyone's windows, nothing. The power outages had been happening more frequently that summer with everyone maxing out the grid, but this was the first time it hit our neighborhood. I fumbled for my phone, grateful for the small bit of light from the screen. It was only 7:30, still technically daylight, but the house felt cave dark with all the blinds closed against the heat. I texted my friend Melissa, who lived 2 streets over, to see if her power was out too, but the message wouldn't send, no signal. That should have been my first real warning, but I just figured the cell towers were overloaded with everyone trying to report the outage. I made my way to the kitchen, using my phone flashlight to find the drawer where I kept candles and matches, thinking this would just be a minor inconvenience. I was lighting the 3rd candle when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks at the front door. Not the friendly rat-a-tat-tat my neighbors usually did, but 3 deliberate, spaced-out pounds that seemed to echo through the silent house. I nearly dropped the match. Who would be going door to door in this heat, especially with the power out? I waited, holding my breath, the match burning down toward my fingers until I had to blow it out. Then came the voice, muffled through the door but clearly male. "Power company, ma'am. Need to check your meter, make sure there's no damage to the lines." His accent was hard to place, not quite local, but trying to sound like it. The way he said ma'am dragged out too long, like he was tasting the word. I set the matches down quietly and crept toward the front door, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near the stairs that Kayla always stepped on when she snuck down for midnight snacks. Through the peephole, I could barely make out a figure in the dying daylight, tall, wearing what looked like a uniform, but no utility truck in the driveway. Just a beat-up sedan parked across the street that I'd never seen before. He knocked again, harder this time, and I watched his head turn slowly, scanning the windows like he was trying to see inside. "I know you're in there," he called out, and my chest tightened. "Saw you come home earlier. Just need 5 minutes to check the meter box. Make sure your breaker didn't cause the outage." That's when it hit me. How could the power company already know about an outage that happened maybe 10 minutes ago? How could they have sent someone this fast? And meters are outside anyway. He didn't need me to open the door for that. I backed away from the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, when I heard something that made every muscle in my body go rigid. From the kitchen, coming from the back of the house, there was the softest click, the sound my back door made when the handle turned. My mind went into overdrive, processing what this meant. The back door had been locked. I always locked it, especially since the divorce, especially when Kayla wasn't home. But there it was, that distinctive click of the latch releasing. Then silence. Whoever was back there was being careful, moving slow. The man at the front door knocked again, louder, more aggressive. "Ma'am, this is urgent. We've had reports of electrical fires in the neighborhood. I need to ensure your safety." His voice had changed, lost its fake friendly tone. Now it sounded irritated, impatient. I could hear him trying the door handle, rattling it. Thank God I'd locked it out of habit. My phone showed 15% battery. I'd forgotten to charge it at work. No signal, no way to call 911. The candles I'd lit in the kitchen were casting dancing shadows on the walls, and I realized they were basically advertising exactly where I was in the house. The smart thing would have been to blow out the candles, but that would mean going back toward the kitchen, toward whoever had just come through my back door. Instead, I moved toward the stairs, placing each foot with the careful precision I'd learned from years of checking on Kayla without waking her. The third step creaked. It always did. But I shifted my weight to the edge where the wood met the wall. From downstairs, I heard the back door close with a gentle thud, so quiet I might have missed it if I hadn't been straining to hear every sound. Then footsteps, slow and measured, moving through my kitchen. Not the heavy boots you'd expect from a utility worker, but something softer, like sneakers. The man outside had gone quiet. No more knocking, no more talking. That terrified me more than the yelling had. It meant they were coordinating, probably communicating somehow. I reached the top of the stairs and had to make a choice. My bedroom with its lock that Kayla had broken last month wrestling with her cousin, or the bathroom with its tiny window that faced the neighbor's house. I chose the bathroom, slipping inside and turning the lock as quietly as possible. The window was one of those frosted glass types, maybe 18 inches square, meant for ventilation, not escape. But the Jeffersons' house was right there, maybe 15 feet away. If I could get their attention somehow. I tried to slide the window open, but it stuck, painted shut from the previous owner years ago. My fingernails bent backward as I tried to force it, the pain sharp enough to make me bite down on my lip to keep from crying out. Downstairs, I could hear drawers being opened in the kitchen, the metallic slide of silverware being moved around. They were searching for something, or maybe just making noise to scare me, to let me know they were there. Then I heard the stairs creak, that third step, the one I'd just carefully avoided. But whoever was coming up didn't know the trick, didn't know to step on the edge. The sound was loud in the quiet house, and it was followed by a pause, like they were listening for my reaction. I grabbed the toilet tank lid, the porcelain heavy and solid in my hands. It was the only weapon I could think of. My phone screen had gone dark to save battery, and I didn't dare turn it back on. The light might show under the door. Another step creaked, then another. Slow, methodical, taking their time. They knew I was trapped up here. Then, from right outside the bathroom door, I heard breathing. Not heavy or labored, just calm, patient breathing, like someone standing perfectly still and listening. My own breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my back against the far wall, holding the tank lid across my chest like a shield. The doorknob turned slightly, testing. The lock held, but these interior doors weren't meant for security. Hollow core, the kind you could probably put your fist through if you really wanted. "Found her," a voice said, different from the one at the front door. This one was younger, almost excited, like this was some kind of game. "Second floor bathroom." He was talking to someone, maybe on a radio or phone, which meant their signals were working just fine. The handle stopped turning, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard him walk away, his footsteps heading toward my bedroom. I could hear him opening drawers, throwing things around. Looking for valuables? Or just trying to make me think he'd moved on? Heavy footsteps came up the stairs now, the first man from the front door. "Jewelry's in the bedroom usually," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Check the closet, top shelf. That's where they always hide the good stuff." They were talking like I wasn't even there, like I was already dealt with. My legs were shaking so bad I had to concentrate on keeping them locked so I wouldn't slide down the wall. Then the younger one laughed, and it was such a normal sound, like he was hanging out with friends, that it made everything worse. "Hey, there's kid stuff in here," he called out. "Toys and things. She got kids?" The first man's response made my entire body go numb. "Saw a girl leaving with some guy a few days ago. Figured she'd be alone for a while. They'd been watching my house. Watching me. Knew when Kayla left with her father, knew my schedule. This wasn't random, they'd picked me specifically, planned this." The bathroom felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. I could hear them tearing through my bedroom now, the sound of my jewelry box hitting the floor, change scattering from the dish on my nightstand. One of them was at my closet, hangers scraping against the rod as he pushed through my clothes. "Check if she's got a safe," the older voice said. Behind pictures, in the closet floor, places like that. They were so casual, so practiced. How many houses had they done this to? Then the younger one said something that sent ice through my veins. "What do you want to do about her?" There was a pause, and I held my breath, pressing my ear against the door. "Let's get what we came for first," the older one replied. "She's not going anywhere. We cut the phone lines before the power went out, and I've got her car keys from the kitchen counter. Even if she runs to a neighbor, we'll be gone before anybody can do anything." That's when something inside me shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it, something else sparked. Anger maybe, or just the refusal to be a victim in my own home. I thought about Kayla, about how I'd fought through a messy divorce, double shifts, and single motherhood. I wasn't going to cower in my bathroom waiting for whatever they decided to do with me. I remembered something my dad taught me when I was young. People expect you to be where they last saw you. They'd heard me in the bathroom, so that's where they assumed I'd stay. Moving as silently as I could, I set down the toilet lid and turned the bathtub faucet on just slightly, enough to make a gentle dripping sound. Then I unlocked the door with painful slowness, turning the mechanism one tiny click at a time. The hallway was dark, but I knew every inch of this house. I could hear them still ransacking my bedroom, arguing now about whether to check the attic. I slipped out and moved toward Kayla's room at the end of the hall, the carpet muffling my footsteps. Her window faced the big oak tree in our yard, the one she'd begged me to let her build a treehouse in. Kayla's room smelled like the strawberry body spray she'd started wearing, convinced it made her seem older. I navigated around her soccer bag and the pile of clothes she never put away, reaching her window. This one I knew would open. She snuck out through it last month to meet friends at the park, not knowing I'd heard everything. The window slid up almost silently, and the evening air hit me like a wall of heat. The tree branch was about 4 feet away, the one Kayla used to shimmy down. But she was 13 and fearless, probably 90 pounds soaking wet. I was pushing 40 and hadn't climbed a tree since middle school. Behind me, I heard footsteps in the hallway. "Hey, water's running in there," the younger voice said. "She trying to call for help or something?" Laughter from the older one. "What's she gonna do, send a message in a bottle?" But I could hear them moving toward the bathroom. In seconds, they'd realize I wasn't there. I didn't think anymore, just climbed out onto the window ledge, my bare feet finding purchase on the wooden siding, and jumped for the branch. My hands hit bark, and I grabbed on with everything I had, my legs swinging wildly underneath me. The branch dipped with my weight but held. My palms were screaming, already torn up, but I managed to swing my leg over and pull myself up. Through the window, I heard the bathroom door slam open. "She's not here." The younger one sounded panicked now. "Check the other rooms, she's gotta be hiding." I didn't wait to hear more. I half climbed, half fell down that tree, branches catching my shirt, scratching my arms and face. 8 feet from the ground, I just let go and dropped, hitting the lawn hard enough to knock the wind out of me. But I was out. I was free. I ran barefoot across my yard toward the Jeffersons' house, not caring about the rocks and sticks stabbing into my feet. Their porch light was off too, but I pounded on their door anyway, screaming for help. Behind me, I could see flashlight beams in Kayla's window. They were looking for me, trying to figure out how I'd vanished. George Jefferson answered the door holding a baseball bat, his wife Nancy right behind him with their German Shepherd Rex growling at her side. "Call 911, I gasped out. "2 men in my house, they cut the phone lines, they have my car keys." George pulled me inside while Nancy ran for their landline. Theirs still worked, thank God. Within minutes, we heard sirens. The 2 men must have heard them too because George saw them sprint out my back door and take off in that beat-up sedan. The cops caught them 3 blocks away, pulled over for running a stop sign. My grandmother's jewelry and my laptop still in their back seat. Turned out they were brothers from Oklahoma, who'd been hitting suburbs across Texas for months, studying routines, waiting for people to be alone. The older one had done time before for home invasion. The younger one was barely 19. They'd been using signal jammers to block cell towers in targeted areas, making it look like power outage complications. The police said I was lucky. Most of their victims had been too scared to move, just hid until they left. But they also told me something that still gives me nightmares. They found rope and zip ties in the trunk of their car. Whatever they'd been planning to do after robbing me, I don't want to know. Kayla came home the next day, and I held her so tight she complained she couldn't breathe. We stayed with the Jeffersons for a week while I had new locks installed, a security system put in, motion lights everywhere. Even now, 6 months later, I still check every window twice before bed, and I keep a phone charger in every room. But mostly, I'm just grateful I trusted that instinct that told me to run, to fight, to not be the victim they expected me to be. The 6 train always smelled like wet metal and disappointment after 11 at night, but I needed to get from the Bronx back to my studio in Chinatown after helping my brother move his stuff out of his ex-girlfriend's place. Jamie had just turned 41, 3 years older than me, and watching him load boxes into that U-Haul with tears streaming down his face made me want to punch something. The platform at Hunts Point Avenue Station was nearly empty when I got there around midnight. Just me, a nurse still in scrubs checking her phone, and 2 drunk guys in Yankees jerseys arguing about batting averages. When the train finally screeched to a stop, I grabbed a seat in the middle car and tried not to think about how my own relationship was heading the same direction as Jamie's. The car was surprisingly crowded for a Monday night. Maybe 30 people scattered across the orange plastic seats, most of them staring at their phones or sleeping against the windows. We were somewhere under the East River when everything went wrong, probably halfway between Manhattan and Brooklyn based on how long we'd been moving through that endless tunnel. The train lurched hard enough to throw a standing passenger into a pole. Then the lights flickered 3 times before dying completely, leaving us in the kind of darkness you forget exists in the city. The emergency lighting didn't kick in, which should have been my first real warning that this wasn't just another MTA breakdown. My ears popped from the sudden pressure change, and the silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat competing with the quiet breathing of strangers around me. People started murmuring, nervous laughs bubbling up here and there, everyone waiting for an announcement that never came. The conductor's booth stayed dark, no static from the speakers, no explanation, just the weight of all that earth and water pressing down above us while we sat trapped in a metal tube. After maybe 2 minutes of nothing, phones started lighting up like fireflies, their weak glow barely cutting through the black. A woman across from me was already dialing 911, but she kept pulling the phone away from her ear, shaking her head. No signal down here, obviously. The guy next to me, wearing a Knicks hoodie and reeking of bourbon, kept pressing the emergency call button above the door, the plastic clicking uselessly with each push. That's when someone at the far end of our car stood up and started walking toward the door that connected to the last car, their phone flashlight sweeping back and forth across the floor. I heard them try the handle, metal scraping against metal, and then their voice cut through the darkness high and thin like they were trying not to scream. "There's something on the window," they said, and every conversation in our car stopped at once. Jesus Christ, I think it's blood. The panic hit like a wave, people jumping up from their seats, more flashlights snapping on, everyone trying to see what this person was talking about. I stayed put, gripping the cold metal bar beside my seat hard enough to hurt, while a cluster of passengers pushed toward the back to look. Their lights converged on the small window in the door between cars, and I could see their shadows shifting, hear their voices rising. A heavy-set man in a security guard uniform pushed through them and pressed his face close to the glass, shining his light through to the other side. He stumbled backward so fast he knocked 2 people over, and the way his face looked in the phone lights, eyes wide, mouth working without making sounds, made my chest tighten. "The last car," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "There's nobody in the last car, but there's blood everywhere. On the seats, the floor, the windows, like someone painted with it." Before anyone could process what that meant, we heard it. Footsteps outside the train, in the tunnel itself, slow and deliberate on the gravel between the tracks. They were coming from behind us, from the direction of the bloody car, getting closer with each step. The nurse I'd seen on the platform pressed herself against the opposite door, her scrubs rustling as she fumbled with her phone, trying again for a signal that wouldn't come. The footsteps stopped right outside our car, and for 10 seconds that felt like hours. We all held our breath, waiting. Then came the knocking, 3 measured taps on the window closest to me, so controlled and patient it made my teeth hurt. I turned my head slowly, my neck muscles fighting me the whole way, and saw a hand pressed against the glass from outside, leaving dark streaks that could only be one thing. The hand was wearing a latex glove, the medical kind, stretched tight and stained crimson up to the wrist. The knocking moved down the length of our car, 3 taps at each window, that gloved hand leaving bloody prints on every surface it touched. A woman near the middle doors started sobbing, pressing her palms over her ears, while her boyfriend wrapped his arms around her and stared at the ceiling like he was praying. When the knocking reached the door between our car and the bloody one, it stopped, and we heard metal scraping against metal like someone was trying to pry open the door from outside. The security guard pulled out a box cutter from his belt, probably the most worthless weapon you could have right then, but at least it was something. He positioned himself between us and the door, legs spread wide like he was ready to tackle whatever came through. The scraping got louder, more insistent, and then we heard something that made everyone in that car start backing away toward the front. A voice from outside, muffled by the tunnel walls but clear enough to understand, singing "Ring Around the Rosie" in a child's melody. Except the words were all wrong. Something about trains and tunnels and things that wait in the dark. The drunk guys in Yankees jerseys tried to force open the doors on the opposite side of the train, throwing their shoulders against them, kicking at the rubber seals. But those doors were designed to stay locked between stations. One of them picked up a fire extinguisher from under a seat and started hammering at a window, the glass spiderwebbing but refusing to shatter, each hit echoing through the car like a gunshot. That's when the lights in the tunnel came on. Not the regular lights, but emergency work lights, harsh and yellow, mounted every 50 feet or so along the walls. What we saw made everyone stop moving, stop breathing, stop everything. There were people in the tunnel, maybe a dozen of them, all wearing those paper medical gowns you get at hospitals, the kind that tie in the back. They were standing perfectly still along both walls, facing our train, their faces covered with surgical masks pulled up over their eyes like blindfolds. Each one had their arms at their sides, palms facing forward, and their hospital gowns were soaked through with what looked like blood, dripping onto the tracks below them. A teenager with a skateboard started hyperventilating, dropping to his knees in the aisle, while an older woman pulled out a rosary and began whispering prayers in Spanish. The security guard backed away from the door, his hand with the box cutter shaking so bad he dropped it twice trying to fold it closed. Those people outside didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, just stood there like mannequins while we watched them through the windows. Then, all at once, like they were following some signal we couldn't hear, they raised their right hands and pointed at our car, every single one of them, in perfect synchronization. The singing started again, but now it was coming from all of them. A chorus of voices echoing off the tunnel walls, getting louder and louder until it felt like the sound was inside my skull. The nurse suddenly screamed and pointed at the floor. There was liquid seeping in under the doors, dark and thick, pooling around our feet, and the smell hit us all at once. Copper and rot and something chemical underneath, like formaldehyde. People started climbing onto the seats trying to get away from the spreading liquid, but there was nowhere to go in that metal box. The man in the Knicks hoodie next to me grabbed my shoulder, his bourbon breath hot in my face, screaming that we needed to get to the front car, that we needed to move now. But when we looked toward the door leading forward, there were shadows moving on the other side of the window. More of those hospital gown figures pressed against the glass, their covered faces tilted at impossible angles like broken dolls. The train suddenly shuddered, a mechanical groan running through the whole structure, and the emergency brakes released with a hiss that sounded like the car itself was dying. We started rolling backward, slowly at first, then picking up speed, heading back the way we came but with no driver, no power, just gravity or something else pulling us deeper into the tunnel. The lights outside flashed by faster and faster, strobing through the windows, and in each flash I could see those figures in hospital gowns running alongside the train, keeping pace with us, their arms pumping mechanically, their heads never moving. The guy with the fire extinguisher lost it completely, screaming about how this was some kind of government experiment, how they were using the subway tunnels for medical testing, how we were all going to end up like whatever was in that last car. He swung the extinguisher at anyone who came near him, catching a young woman in a Columbia University sweatshirt across the shoulder, sending her sprawling into that awful liquid on the floor. The security guard tried to calm him down, but the guy turned and sprayed him full in the face with foam, white chemical clouds filling the car, making it even harder to see or breathe. Through the chaos, I heard the nurse shouting something about recognizing the smell, about formaldehyde and tissue preservation, about how she'd worked at Mount Sinai's morgue during her residency. And this was exactly what the basement storage area smelled like after a power failure in summer, when the cooling systems failed and everything started to decompose. The train kept accelerating backward, and someone near the rear door started pounding on it, screaming that they could see lights ahead, or behind us technically, like we were approaching a station. The train slammed to a stop so hard that everyone went flying. I hit the pole in front of me chest first, feeling ribs crack while bodies piled up against the rear door in a tangle of limbs and screams. The lights outside went out again, leaving us in complete darkness except for a few phone flashlights still working, their beams cutting through the chemical fog from the fire extinguisher. For maybe 30 seconds, there was no sound except groaning and crying, people trying to untangle themselves, checking for injuries. Then the doors opened, not just unlocked, but sliding wide open with their normal mechanical whir, even though the power was supposedly dead. Fresh air rushed in, mixing with the formaldehyde stench, and we could hear the echo of a massive space beyond the train. People started pushing toward the doors, desperate to get out, but the nurse grabbed anyone she could reach, shouting that we didn't know where we were, that this wasn't a normal station. She was right. When I finally made it to a door and looked out, we were in some kind of underground warehouse, concrete walls stretching up into darkness, industrial lights hanging from chains, and rows upon rows of metal tables covered with white sheets. The sheets weren't flat. They had shapes underneath them, human shapes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, laid out like we'd rolled into some kind of mass morgue. The passengers who'd already left the train were standing frozen on the platform, staring at the tables, some of them backing slowly toward the train again. That's when the sheets started moving, not all at once but in waves, like something was waking up underneath them. The man in the Knicks hoodie whispered no over and over, grabbing my arm so tight I thought he'd cut off circulation. One by one, bodies sat up under those sheets, the fabric falling away to reveal people in various states of decay, some fresh, some skeletal, all wearing hospital bracelets with dates from the past week. They turned their heads toward us in unison, empty eye sockets and clouded eyes all focusing on our train. And then they started climbing off the tables, their movements jerky and wrong, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. The security guard shoved everyone back into the train car, screaming at people to get inside, that we needed to close the doors, but the doors wouldn't respond to the emergency buttons, staying wide open while those things stumbled closer, their hospital gowns. The same gowns as the figures in the tunnel, trailing behind them like wings. Just when the first wave of bodies reached the platform edge, maybe 10 feet from our doors, the train's emergency system kicked in. A recorded announcement blared through speakers we thought were dead, telling us to remain calm, that transit police had been notified, that we'd be moving shortly. The doors snapped shut so fast they nearly caught the security guard's arm, and the train lurched forward, not backward this time, accelerating smooth and normal like nothing had happened. The lights flickered back on, bright fluorescent normal subway lighting, and suddenly we were just sitting in a regular train car again, covered in foam from the fire extinguisher, bruised and terrified but moving. Through the windows we could see normal tunnel walls flashing by, the familiar orange emergency lights every 100 feet. No sign of those figures in hospital gowns or that underground warehouse. We burst out of the tunnel into Canal Street Station 3 minutes later, the platform full of waiting passengers who stepped back when they saw us stumble out. 30 people covered in blood and chemicals, some crying, some still screaming, all of us looking like we'd crawled out of hell. The cops who showed up 20 minutes later didn't believe a word of it, of course. They found the blood in the last car, ran DNA tests that came back matching 7 different missing persons from the past month, all of them last seen in the subway system. But when they sent teams back into that tunnel with the MTA maintenance crews, they found nothing. No warehouse, no bodies, no evidence of anyone being in the tunnel at all except for some scuff marks on the walls. The official report blamed a combination of mechanical failure and mass hysteria, suggested the blood was from an unrelated incident that happened to coincide with the blackout. They closed that section of track for 3 weeks for maintenance, and when it reopened, they'd installed new lighting, new emergency systems, new everything. I moved out of the city 2 months later, couldn't handle taking the subway anymore, couldn't stop thinking about those clouded eyes and jerky movements. But sometimes I check the news and every few months there's another story. A train stops unexpectedly in that same tunnel. Passengers report strange noises outside. Someone claims they saw figures in hospital gowns through the windows. The MTA always has an explanation, always mentions track work or signal problems, but I know what's really down there, waiting in the dark between stations, and I know it's only a matter of time before those doors open again at the wrong platform. My 4th espresso was burning its way down my throat in the break room at Cedars Medical Center when I checked my phone. 6:13 in the morning, February something. Couldn't even remember the exact date anymore. 18 hours into what should have been a 14-hour shift, and my body had stopped belonging to me months ago. First-year surgical intern meant you became property of whoever was coding, crashing, or bleeding out on any given table. Yesterday's blood still decorated my scrubs because finding time for laundry between rounds was like finding a unicorn in the parking garage. Dr. Harrison liked to say interns ran on pure caffeine and stubbornness, and after 6 months of this grinding routine, my reflection in the bathroom mirror was starting to prove him right. By 7 that Monday morning, the ER was already chaos incarnate, with Harrison commanding the floor like a general watching his troops fall one by one. Those harsh fluorescent lights turned everyone into walking corpses, which pretty much described those of us who hadn't seen our own beds in 48 hours. Angela Ramirez burst through the emergency doors around 9:30, her screams cutting through the usual morning pandemonium like a knife through tissue. Amniotic fluid had soaked through her yellow maternity dress, and she was sobbing that her husband Carlos was trapped somewhere on the 405, that the baby wasn't due for 3 more weeks, that something was wrong, really wrong. Dr. Harrison took one glance at the fetal monitor, and his jaw clenched in that way that meant we were about to lose someone if we didn't move fast. The baby's heart rate was plummeting, classic signs of cord strangulation, and we had maybe 5 minutes before brain damage became irreversible. Harrison's grip on my shoulder left marks through my scrubs as he shouted for OR3 to be prepped immediately, that we were cutting now, no time for anything fancy. Angela kept grabbing at my hands, begging me to save her baby, her voice growing fainter as we raced toward surgery, and all I could focus on was how her nail polish was this perfect coral pink, probably painted special for meeting her child. Inside OR3, everything moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Nurses counting instruments, anesthesiologist calling out vitals, Harrison scrubbing in while rattling off orders faster than I could process them. Angela was fading in and out of consciousness as they positioned her on the table, her lips moving in what looked like a prayer, though no sound came out anymore. Harrison made the first incision at 9:43. I remember because I kept glancing at the wall clock, watching each second tick by like a countdown to disaster. Blood welled up immediately, more than normal, and Harrison muttered something about placental abruption that made my chest tighten with dread. We were halfway through the procedure, Harrison's hands working inside Angela's open abdomen to free the baby, when I felt it, a subtle shift in the floor beneath my feet, like standing on a boat deck. For a split second, nobody moved, everyone's eyes meeting across Angela's draped body, and then the whole world exploded into violent motion. Everything happened at once, surgical instruments clattering off trays, IV poles swaying like drunken dancers, and that horrible grinding sound of concrete fighting against itself somewhere deep in the building's bones. An earthquake, my brain registered dimly, even as my hands instinctively pressed down on Angela's abdomen to keep the incision stable. Harrison was shouting to maintain sterile field, to keep going, that we couldn't stop now with the baby half delivered. But the lights started flickering like a horror movie strobe effect. One of the nurses, Bethany I think, lost her balance and crashed into the instrument table, sending scalpels and forceps flying across the floor in a metallic rainfall. The building groaned and swayed, and I could hear car alarms going off in the parking structure, mixing with screams from other operating rooms down the hall. Then, with a sound like God flipping a switch, everything went completely, utterly black. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved or breathed, the darkness so complete I couldn't see my own hands even though they were still buried in Angela's open belly. Then the emergency generator kicked in with a mechanical roar from somewhere below us, and those blessed red emergency lights bathed everything in a hellish glow that was better than nothing. Harrison's face looked demonic in that crimson light, his eyes wild as he screamed at me to retract, to hold steady while he pulled the baby free. Angela's blood was everywhere now, pooling on the floor where the earthquake had knocked over the suction equipment, and the baby, God, the baby was purple, the cord wrapped twice around its tiny neck like a noose. Another aftershock hit just as Harrison got his hands around the infant's shoulders, sending everyone stumbling again, and I had to physically throw myself across Angela's legs to keep her from sliding off the tilted table. That's when the generator started making a sound I'll never forget. A high-pitched whining like a dying animal, followed by 3 loud bangs that shook the whole floor. Complete darkness again, but this time it was different. Final somehow. No mechanical roar promising salvation, no emergency lights flickering back to life, just the raw black of a tomb while Angela bled and bled beneath my trembling fingers. Someone's phone, turned out to be mine, had fallen from my pocket during the first quake and Bethany grabbed it, turning on the flashlight with shaking hands that made shadows dance like demons on the walls. In that narrow beam of white light, I could see Harrison hadn't stopped working, his hands moving by pure muscle memory and decades of experience, unwrapping the cord from the baby's neck while counting compressions under his breath. Angela's pulse was getting weaker under my palm, her blood pressure dropping so fast the manual monitor couldn't keep up, and we all knew what that meant. She was bleeding internally, probably from where the placenta had torn, and without power for the cauterizer or proper light to see what we were doing. We were just playing blind surgeon in a nightmare. The baby finally came free with a wet, horrible sound, limp and silent in Harrison's blood-slicked hands, and he thrust the tiny body at Bethany while turning back to Angela's hemorrhaging womb. Manual compressions on the uterus now. Harrison's voice cut through the darkness like a whip, and my hands moved before my brain could catch up, plunging into Angela's abdomen to find her uterus and squeeze, trying to stop the bleeding through sheer pressure. The phone's flashlight beam jumped wildly as Bethany tried to work on the baby one-handed, clearing airways, starting chest compressions with her thumb and index finger on that impossibly small chest. I could feel Angela's life pumping out between my fingers, warm and unstoppable, while Harrison packed gauze after gauze into the cavity, working by touch alone in the spaces where the light couldn't reach. Another aftershock rattled the building, weaker this time but still strong enough to send more equipment crashing, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the fire alarm going off, adding its shriek to the symphony of chaos. The anesthesiologist, Kevin, his name finally came to me, was manually bagging Angela, counting out loud to keep rhythm while tears streamed down his face in the phone's harsh light. Then, cutting through all that noise and terror, came the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, a tiny, angry wail from the baby in Bethany's arms. She'd gotten the infant breathing, and that cry meant brain function, meant hope, meant at least one of them might make it out of this darkness alive. But Angela was fading fast, her skin already taking on that waxy look that meant she'd lost too much blood, and Harrison was running out of options. "We need to get her to another OR somewhere with power," he said, but we all knew that was impossible. The hallways were pitch black, probably full of debris, and moving her would mean certain death. That's when I remembered something from my emergency training, something so basic it was almost stupid, but desperate times and all that. My car was in the parking structure, and I always kept jumper cables and a portable battery pack in the trunk. Not enough to power an OR, but maybe, just maybe, enough to run a single cauterizer for the 30 seconds we'd need to seal the worst bleeders. Harrison didn't hesitate, just nodded and kept packing while I explained my insane plan to Kevin, who was already pulling off his surgical gown to make the run with me. We left Bethany with the baby and Harrison keeping pressure on Angela's wounds, and we ran through those black corridors like our lives depended on it, which they didn't, but Angela's did. The emergency stairs were a death trap of fallen ceiling tiles and broken glass, and we had to feel our way down 9 flights in complete darkness, guided only by the backup light on Kevin's phone. The parking structure was worse, cars scattered at weird angles from the quake, some with alarms still blaring, others with windows shattered across the concrete. My little Ford was on level 3, thankfully still in one piece, and we tore open the trunk like maniacs, grabbing the battery pack, jumper cables, and anything else that looked useful. Kevin found a camping lantern I'd forgotten about, one of those LED things that could light up a whole room, and we grabbed that too before sprinting back through the maze of destruction. Getting back up took forever, or at least it felt that way, each second stretching like an hour while Angela bled out 9 floors above us. Kevin went ahead with the lantern, clearing a path through the debris, while I followed with the battery pack clutched against my chest like a newborn. We could hear people calling for help from behind locked doors, probably staff and patients trapped when the automatic locks engaged during the power failure. But we couldn't stop. Not now. When we finally burst back into OR3, the scene that greeted us was something from a war zone. Blood everywhere. Harrison working by the light of 3 phones now propped at different angles. Bethany doing her best to keep both the baby warm and assist Harrison simultaneously. Angela was still breathing, barely, but her blood pressure was almost non-existent, and Harrison's face told me everything I needed to know about her chances. We had maybe 2 minutes, probably less. Kevin and I rigged up the battery pack to the cauterizer in 45 seconds flat, our hands working on pure autopilot, while Harrison identified the 3 main bleeders by touch. The LED lantern lit up the OR like a stage, throwing our giant shadows on the walls as we worked, and for the first time since the power died, Harrison could actually see what he was doing. The cauterizer came to life with a buzz that sounded like angels singing, and Harrison went to work with the precision of a master craftsman, sealing off vessels while I maintained pressure and Kevin pushed unit after unit of O- into Angela's remaining IV line. Each sealed vessel meant less blood loss, meant her pressure starting to stabilize, meant hope creeping back into that room one careful burn at a time. Bethany had wrapped the baby in warming blankets from the crash cart, and its cries had gotten stronger, angrier, more insistent. The sound of life demanding attention. We worked in perfect synchronization, no words needed, just hands moving in a choreography born from training and desperation. By the time the battery pack died 17 minutes later, we'd done it. The major bleeding was controlled, Angela's vitals were stabilizing, and both mother and baby were alive. Real help arrived 20 minutes after that, firefighters with generators and emergency medical teams who'd finally cleared a path through the collapsed sections of the hospital. They evacuated Angela to UCLA Medical Center, which still had power, where she spent 3 weeks in the ICU but eventually walked out carrying her daughter. They named her Hope, which felt right considering everything. Harrison put me in for a commendation, said I'd shown the kind of thinking that makes great surgeons, but honestly, I just did what anyone would have done when lives were hanging in the balance. Sometimes I still dream about that darkness, about the warmth of Angela's blood between my fingers, about how close we came to losing them both. But then I remember that angry little cry cutting through the chaos, and I remind myself that sometimes, even in the absolute worst moments, human stubbornness and a camping lantern are enough to beat the odds. Sunday afternoon at Dauphine Street Clinic started like any other overtime shift, with me checking vitals and restocking supplies while rain tapped against the windows. I'd been a paramedic in New Orleans for 6 years by then, started right after my 26th birthday, and we'd seen our share of storms roll through. Our clinic occupied one of those old converted townhouses, 3 stories of peeling paint and creaky floors that somehow kept passing inspection year after year. We had 12 patients on the first floor that day, mostly elderly folks who couldn't make it to the bigger hospitals, and just me and 2 nurses. Donna, who'd been doing this since before I was born, and Jasmine, fresh from nursing school with that nervous energy newcomers always carry. Weather reports kept changing every hour, first saying the storm would veer east, then west, then suddenly admitting they had no clue where this monster was heading. By 3 in the afternoon, the street outside had turned into a river. I watched through the window as a shopping cart floated past, followed by someone's patio furniture, the white plastic chairs bobbing like boats. Water was climbing the steps to our entrance faster than I'd ever seen, brownish gray and carrying all kinds of debris. Donna kept checking on old Walter in bed 3, who needed oxygen constantly, while Jasmine helped me move supplies to the 2nd floor, just in case, we told ourselves. Each gust of wind made the building groan like it was in pain, and I could hear water starting to seep through the 100-year-old window frames. That's when dispatch called saying all units were being pulled back to higher ground. But when I looked outside at the current rushing past our door, I knew we'd missed our window to leave safely. Water started pushing under the front door around 4, spreading across the linoleum like spilled coffee in slow motion. I grabbed towels from the supply closet, but it was like trying to stop a river with tissue paper. Within minutes, the floor was covered in an inch of murky water that smelled like sewage and motor oil. Jasmine's voice cracked when she called out from the main ward. The water was coming through the back entrance too, pooling around the wheels of the beds. We had maybe 30 minutes before the first floor would be completely flooded, and half our patients couldn't even walk. There was Eleanor with her broken hip, Walter on his oxygen tank, and Mr. Briggs, who'd had a stroke last month and could barely move his left side. I remember standing there for a second, water soaking through my boots, calculating how many trips up the narrow staircase it would take to move everyone. Donna took charge like she always did in a crisis, her voice cutting through the sound of rushing water and howling wind. She assigned Jasmine to start disconnecting the mobile patients from their IVs, while she prepped the medical equipment we'd need upstairs. I started with Eleanor, sliding my arms under her frail body, while she whimpered about the cold water touching her legs. The staircase was barely wide enough for one person, let alone carrying someone, and the old wood was already slippery from the humidity. Each step creaked under our combined weight, and I had to stop twice to readjust my grip, Eleanor's fingers digging into my shoulder like bird claws. When I finally got her settled in a second-floor room and rushed back down, the water had risen another 3 inches. Through the window, I saw a car float by, its alarm still somehow blaring underwater, the red lights flashing beneath the surface like some kind of drowning emergency beacon. We managed to get 6 patients upstairs before the lights started flickering. Every time they dimmed, my chest tightened, knowing what would happen if we lost power completely. The elevator was already out of the question. Nobody trusted that ancient cage in good weather, let alone during a flood. Jasmine and I tried to move Walter next, but his oxygen tank weighed almost as much as he did. We had to carry him in his wheelchair to the stairs. Then I held him up while Jasmine lugged the tank, step by agonizing step. His breathing was getting shallower, whistling through the tubes, and halfway up, he grabbed my arm and gasped that he couldn't breathe. We had to stop right there on the landing, Jasmine fumbling with the oxygen flow while I held Walter upright, the water below us now reaching the 3rd step and climbing fast. I could hear things floating around down there, medical equipment, furniture, files, all churning in that dark soup that used to be our clinic floor. That's when the transformer outside exploded. The flash lit up the whole street for a second, bright white like lightning had struck right outside our window, and then everything went black. Not just regular dark, the kind of thick, heavy darkness that presses against your eyes and makes you wonder if they're even open. The sound of water suddenly seemed louder, closer, like it was right behind us in the stairwell. Jasmine let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream but close enough, and Walter's grip on my arm turned painful. I had my phone in my pocket, fumbled for it with one hand while holding Walter with the other, and when I finally got the flashlight on, the beam was pathetically weak against all that darkness. In that thin circle of light, I could see Jasmine's face pale and terrified, and Walter's eyes wide with panic. Below us, the water kept rising, and we still had 5 more patients down there, including Mr. Briggs, who couldn't move without help, and a woman named Ruth who'd just had surgery 3 days ago. We got Walter to the 2nd floor, but I could hear Donna yelling from below, her voice competing with the roar of water that was now pouring through the windows. I left Jasmine with Walter and practically fell down the stairs in the dark, using my phone's light to navigate. The 1st floor was a nightmare, water up to my thighs, cold and powerful enough to knock me sideways when I stepped off the last stair. Donna was waist-deep near Mr. Briggs' bed, trying to lift him while Ruth clung to her bed rails, crying. The water had this current to it, pulling everything toward the back of the building, and debris kept hitting my legs. Clipboards, medicine bottles, someone's shoe. I waded over to help Donna, and together we got Mr. Briggs sitting up, but he was dead weight on his left side. His good arm wrapped around my neck so tight I could barely breathe, and Donna and I had to coordinate every move to keep him above water. The smell was overwhelming, sewage and chemicals and something else, something rotten that made me want to gag. Getting him to the stairs was like moving through molasses while someone threw punches at your legs. Every piece of floating furniture became an obstacle, every step a gamble on whether the floor was still there, or if you were about to step into a hole. When we finally reached the staircase, I realized the horrible truth. We'd have to carry him up in complete darkness because I needed both hands to support his weight. I shoved my phone in my mouth, biting down on it to keep the light pointed forward, tasting the dirty water on the case. Donna went first, pulling Mr. Briggs' shoulders while I pushed from below, my back screaming with the effort. His body kept slipping, sliding back toward me, and twice I thought we were going to drop him. Behind us, I could hear Ruth still calling for help, her voice getting more desperate, and the sound of water climbing higher, swallowing more of our clinic with every passing second. After we got Mr. Briggs upstairs, I knew I had to go back for Ruth. But when I turned toward the stairs, Donna grabbed my arm with this grip that could have broken bone. Her face in the phone's light looked 20 years older than when the day started, and she was breathing hard, wheezing almost as bad as Walter had been. She told me the water was coming up too fast, that we needed to get everyone to the 3rd floor now because the 2nd floor wouldn't hold much longer. I could already hear it, water finding its way through the old building's bones, seeping through places we couldn't see. But Ruth was still down there, and I could hear her voice, weaker now, but still calling. I pulled away from Donna and headed back down, taking the stairs 3 at a time in the dark, my phone's battery icon showing red in the corner. The water hit my chest when I reached the bottom, cold enough to steal my breath, and the current was stronger, angrier, trying to sweep me toward the back of the building where I could hear windows breaking. Ruth was barely keeping her head above water when I found her, her arms wrapped around the bed's side rail, knuckles white even in the dim light. She'd had abdominal surgery, couldn't use her core muscles to pull herself up, and every wave that hit her face left her sputtering and gasping. I got behind her, hooked my arms under hers, and started pulling her toward the stairs, fighting the current with every step. Pieces of the ceiling were falling now, wet chunks of plaster that hit the water with heavy splashes. The building was coming apart around us, 100-year-old wood and plaster no match for the force of all that water. Ruth kept apologizing, saying she was sorry for being trouble, sorry for being heavy, and I wanted to tell her to save her breath, but I needed all of mine just to keep us moving. A filing cabinet floated past, spinning slowly like some kind of metal boat, and I had to push it away before it pinned us against the wall. My legs were going numb from the cold, and I couldn't tell if the floor was still there or if we were swimming. We made it to the stairs just as my phone died, plunging us into absolute darkness. Ruth was crying harder now, her breath coming in these short, panicked gasps that scared me more than the water. I had to feel for each step with my foot, pulling her up while she tried to help with her one good leg. The water was following us up. I could hear it splashing against the steps below, chasing us like something alive. Halfway up, Ruth went limp. Not unconscious, just exhausted, unable to help anymore. I had to practically drag her the rest of the way, my arms burning, lungs screaming for air I couldn't seem to get enough of. When we finally reached the second floor, Donna and Jasmine pulled us away from the stairs, and I collapsed on the wet floor, coughing up water I didn't remember swallowing. Through the window I could see the streetlights were underwater now, still somehow glowing beneath the surface like giant jellyfish, and debris spinning past in the current. Someone's front door, a bicycle, things that used to belong to people's normal lives before today. We spent the next 6 hours huddled on the 3rd floor, all 12 patients and us 3 workers crammed into 2 rooms while the building shook and creaked around us. The water stopped rising about a foot below the 3rd floor, but we could hear it sloshing beneath us, testing the old floorboards. Walter's oxygen tank ran out around midnight, and we had to take turns manually pumping air into his lungs with a bag valve mask until the Coast Guard helicopter finally found us at dawn. They had to break through the roof to get us out, lifting patients one by one in a basket while the building swayed beneath us. I was the last one up, and as the helicopter pulled away, I looked back at the clinic, our clinic, now just a broken shell sticking out of the brown water. 3 people died in other buildings on our street that night, but we didn't lose anyone. Not one. Sometimes I still dream about that darkness, about the weight of carrying people up those stairs while the water chased us. But mostly I remember Donna's iron grip when she grabbed my arm, and how Ruth stopped apologizing once we got her safe, and how all of us, broken and scared and soaking wet, somehow made it through the longest night of our lives. The power went out around 7 that evening, right when I was heating up leftover Chinese food from the place down on Vermont Avenue. Living alone for the first time at 31 wasn't exactly where I thought I'd be after the divorce, but the apartment on the 4th floor had become my sanctuary, my little corner where I could finally breathe again. The microwave beeped once, then everything just died. The hum of the refrigerator, the air conditioning unit struggling against the September heat, even the faint buzz from the fluorescent light in the hallway outside. The building manager, Frank, had warned us about rolling blackouts with all the heat waves hitting the city lately. Said the grid couldn't handle everyone blasting their AC units at the same time. I grabbed my phone to check the power company's website, but the signal was barely crawling, probably because everyone in the neighborhood was doing the exact same thing. I lit a few candles I'd bought from the dollar store, vanilla and cinnamon, a weird combination, but they were on sale, and settled onto my couch with a book, figuring I might as well make the best of it. The apartment felt different in the candlelight, shadows dancing in corners I'd never noticed before, making familiar furniture look strange and distorted. Around 9, maybe 9:30, I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy ones, like someone wearing work boots or something similar. Nothing unusual there. People came and went at all hours in this building, mostly young professionals and a few older couples who'd been here since the 90s. But then the footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I waited for the sound of keys jingling, a door opening, but nothing came. After maybe a minute, they continued up the stairs to the 5th floor, each step echoing in the silent building. The unit directly above mine, 5B, had been empty for 3 months after old Mr. Garrett moved to Phoenix to live with his daughter. That's when I heard it, a door closing upstairs followed by more footsteps. But these were different, softer, like someone trying not to make noise. The ceiling in my living room creaked in that specific way it does when someone walks across the floor above, a sound I'd gotten used to when Mr. Garrett lived there with his ancient cat Patches. My first thought was maybe Frank was showing the apartment to someone, even though 9 at night seemed like a strange time for that. But then again, people in this city worked weird hours. I went back to my book, some thriller I'd grabbed from the library about a woman who finds out her neighbor is a serial killer. Probably not the best choice for a blackout, but I was already halfway through. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 minutes, pacing back and forth, and then came this rhythmic tapping, like someone dropping marbles one by one onto the hardwood floor. The sound was oddly specific: 5 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, then 5 again, repeating over and over until I couldn't concentrate on reading anymore. I grabbed my phone to text Frank about someone being in 5B, but my battery was at 12% and still no signal. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by complete silence that somehow felt heavier than before. I stood there in my living room, holding my phone like it might suddenly spring to life with answers, when I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor upstairs. Not the casual rearranging kind of sound, but slow, deliberate scraping that made my teeth hurt. The candles flickered, probably from me walking past them too quickly, but in that moment it felt like the whole apartment was holding its breath. Then came the knock, not from upstairs but from my front door. 3 solid raps that made me jump hard enough to knock over my glass of water on the coffee table. I crept toward the door, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near the kitchen, and looked through the peephole, but the hallway was pitch black. Not even the emergency exit sign was working. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out thin and shaky. No response. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for breathing, movement, anything. But there was nothing except the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. My neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Gonzalez, usually kept her TV on until midnight, but tonight there was no muffled sound of game shows or telenovelas bleeding through the walls. The whole building felt abandoned, like everyone had evacuated except me. I backed away from the door, grabbed the biggest knife from my kitchen drawer, the one I'd bought for cutting watermelons but never actually used, and sat on my couch facing the entrance. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and I started to think maybe I'd imagined it, or it was just someone at the wrong apartment, confused in the darkness. That's when my phone finally gave up, the screen going black just as I was trying to dial 911, leaving me with no way to call for help. The footsteps upstairs started again, but now they were moving in circles, around and around, like someone was looking for something they'd dropped. I could track their path by the creaking living room, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, then back to the living room over and over in the same pattern. My candles were burning low, maybe an hour of light left if I was lucky, and I started calculating how long until sunrise, trying to remember if it was closer to 6 or 6:30 this time of year. Then I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense up. The sound of my doorknob turning, slowly, testing to see if it was locked. Thank God I'd gotten into the habit of deadbolting it after that creepy delivery guy incident last month. The knob turned back and forth a few more times, more aggressive now, and then stopped. I held that knife so tight my knuckles ached, staring at the door, waiting. The footsteps upstairs had stopped too, and for a moment everything was completely still, like the building itself was waiting to see what would happen next. a new sound broke the silence. Faint knocking coming from above, not like someone at a door, but like knuckles against the floor, right above where I was sitting. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Directly over my head as if someone was lying on the floor up there, tapping down at me. I moved to the kitchen, and after a few seconds, the knocking followed, staying right above me. When I stepped into my bedroom, it followed there too, tracking my movements perfectly through the ceiling. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had broken into 5B. Maybe they were on drugs or having some kind of episode. But how could they know exactly where I was in the dark? The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and then it hit me like ice water in my veins. Whoever was up there had been in my apartment before, knew the layout, knew which floorboards lined up with which rooms below. The realization made me want to throw up, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. I decided to make a run for it, grab my keys and get out, sleep in my car if I had to. Anything was better than staying here. But as I rushed toward the hallway where I'd left my purse, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps inside my apartment, in my bedroom, even though I was standing in the living room. Not possible, I thought. I would have heard someone come in, but there it was, the unmistakable sound of my closet door sliding open, the one that always stuck and made that specific grinding noise. My bedroom was only 15 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. The footsteps moved around in there, unhurried, like someone familiar with the space, opening drawers, moving things around. I stood frozen in my living room, that knife still in my hand but feeling completely useless, as I heard my jewelry box open. The one that played that tiny melody when you lifted the lid, a gift from my grandmother that I'd kept even though I never wore jewelry anymore. The melody played out completely, all 20 seconds of it, and then I heard whistling. Someone in my bedroom was whistling along to the tune, getting every note perfect like they'd heard it 100 times before. My legs finally responded and I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt in the dark, my fingers slippery with sweat. Behind me, the footsteps left my bedroom, moving down the hallway toward me, not running but walking steadily, confidently. The deadbolt finally turned and I yanked the door open, ready to scream for help. But standing in my doorway was Frank, holding a flashlight that wasn't turned on, wearing his usual maintenance uniform, but with something wrong about his expression. Too calm, too pleased. "Going somewhere?" he asked, and his voice had this strange quality to it, like he was trying not to laugh. Behind me, the footsteps from my bedroom had stopped, and when I glanced back, there was nobody there, just my empty hallway and the dying candlelight flickering from the living room. "Frank, someone's in my apartment," I whispered, my voice barely working. He tilted his head, that weird, almost smile still on his face, and took a step forward, forcing me to step back into my apartment. "Nobody's here but us," he said, pulling something from his pocket, a key ring with way too many keys, jangling them slowly. "Checked all the units during the blackout, making sure everyone's safe. Found some interesting things in 5B though. Mr. Garrett left some furniture behind, had to move it around to check the windows." He stepped inside fully now, closing my door behind him with his foot. "Funny thing about these old buildings," he continued, walking past me into my living room like he owned the place. "The maintenance tunnels between floors. Most people don't even know they exist. Perfect for checking pipes, electrical work, moving between units without using the hallways." My brain was screaming at me to run, but he was between me and the door now, still jangling those keys, and I realized one of them was labeled 4D, my apartment. "Been checking on you for months," Frank said, sitting down on my couch like we were old friends catching up. "You know, after your divorce, living alone, thought you might need someone looking after you. That ex-husband of yours, real piece of work, calling here asking about you, wanting to know if you had any male visitors. Told him you were doing just fine on your own." He picked up my book from the coffee table, flipping through it casually. "You should really vary your routine though. Chinese food every Friday, library every Saturday morning, grocery store Sunday afternoons. Makes it too easy for the wrong people to know when you're home." The knife was still in my hand, hidden behind my back. and I was calculating if I could make it to the bathroom, lock myself in, maybe break the window and scream for help. But Frank seemed to read my mind, standing up and positioning himself between me and the hallway. The bathroom window's been painted shut since last winter, remember? You put in a maintenance request about it, but I never got around to fixing it. A lot of things in this building I never quite get around to fixing. Something in me snapped then. Maybe it was anger overtaking the fear or just pure survival instinct. But I brought that knife forward and pointed it at him. Get out of my apartment right now or I'll scream so loud the whole building will hear. Frank actually laughed, a genuine amused sound that made my skin prickle. During a blackout? When half the building's empty because people went to stay with friends who have generators? Go ahead. But I did scream, loud and long, and to my surprise I heard doors opening in the hallway. Voices calling out, footsteps running. Frank's expression changed instantly, the smugness replaced with something like panic. Turns out Mrs. Gonzalez hadn't evacuated after all, and neither had the college kids from 4F. Within seconds, there were people pounding on my door, asking if I was okay, threatening to call the cops. Frank tried to play it off, opening the door with his master key, telling everyone he was just checking on residents during the blackout. But Mrs. Gonzalez wasn't buying it. She pushed past him, grabbed my arm, and pulled me into the hallway, announcing loudly that I was staying with her tonight, and that somebody better call the police right now because Frank had no business being in a young woman's apartment at this hour. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Apparently, the college kids had managed to get through to 911 on their phone. When they searched Frank's apartment in the basement, they found a whole collection of things that made my stomach turn. A notebook with detailed schedules of female residents, copies of keys he wasn't supposed to have, and photos taken through apartment windows. The real kicker was when they checked the maintenance tunnels he'd mentioned. There were makeshift platforms between floors where he could access certain apartments through ventilation grates he'd modified. He'd been doing this for years, apparently, but most residents who'd complained about strange noises or things being moved had been dismissed as paranoid or had simply moved out. The police found my spare key in his pocket, the one I thought I'd lost at the laundromat 3 months ago. They also discovered he'd installed tiny holes in the ceiling of my apartment, barely visible, that lined up with the floor of 5B, which explained how he could track my movements so precisely from above. Frank was arrested that night, charged with stalking, breaking, and entering, and a bunch of other things my lawyer later explained to me. I moved out the next week, stayed with my sister in Pasadena until I could find a new place. The other women in the building filed a joint lawsuit against the property management company for failing to properly screen their employees. Turns out Frank had been fired from 2 previous buildings for similar complaints that were never formally investigated. I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, especially during power outages, and I always check my ceilings for any unusual holes or marks. But Mrs. Gonzalez was right about one thing she told me that night while we waited for the police. Trust your instincts, mija. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I just wish I'd trusted mine sooner. These days I live in a building with multiple security cameras, electronic locks that track every entry, and most importantly, no maintenance tunnels between floors. And I never, ever ignore footsteps in the night. No one ever stays past 9 on the 12th floor, but I had a deadline and thought I could finish a few more pages before heading home. The office was almost silent except for the hum of the old fluorescent lights and the occasional passing siren from the streets below. It was late autumn, the kind of night where the air outside looks sharp, the windows fog from the inside, and the city feels strangely hollow. My name's Claire, and at that time I was 26, working as a junior analyst for a small architectural firm tucked between 2 glass towers in downtown Chicago. The company wasn't glamorous, but I liked the rhythm. Late nights, empty hallways, the steady calm of a city that never truly sleeps. When the clock hit 9:47, I packed my bag and sent one last email before heading to the elevator. The building had that corporate stillness that always made me uneasy after hours. Even the air conditioning sounded unsure of itself. The elevator button glowed faintly when I pressed it, reflecting off the metal panel. I remember glancing at my phone, 11% battery, before stepping inside. It was one of those older elevators with a dull brass railing and a carpet that had seen better decades. The doors closed, sealing me in with the faint scent of old wiring and cleaning chemicals. The elevator jolted as it began to descend, a sluggish mechanical groan echoing through the shaft. I leaned against the wall, half thinking about ordering a ride-share home, half thinking about the eerie silence that had swallowed the building. Then it happened. Everything went black. The hum of the elevator died mid-motion. For a second, I thought it was a simple flicker, a surge maybe, but the silence that followed was absolute. No motion, no light. Just the faint echo of metal cooling around me. My phone's screen lit up when I unlocked it, the only blue glow in the suffocating dark. I tapped the emergency button. Nothing. No buzz, no click. I tried the call button next, but it was dead too. The air felt heavy, like the elevator itself was holding its breath. I checked my phone again, 8%. No signal. That was when I first heard it. A faint tapping sound echoing from below. So soft I almost convinced myself it was just the cables shifting. It came in intervals, spaced out evenly, like someone was testing a rhythm on the metal. I told myself it was the building settling, but each time I whispered hello, the tapping stopped, then started again, a little closer. I called out again, louder this time, but my voice felt like it got swallowed by the dark. The tapping stopped. The air around me thickened with silence, so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of my wristwatch. I held my phone up, trying to use the dim light to see the ceiling vent. The metal above me seemed endless, a narrow throat of shadows. When the sound returned, it came from somewhere higher, not below anymore, but closer to the top of the shaft. It was deliberate now, each strike echoing longer than the last, like something metallic brushing along the walls, dragging itself closer inch by inch. I thought about forcing the doors open, but my legs wouldn't move at first. I kept telling myself it had to be maintenance workers trying to fix the power, but that lie didn't hold up when I heard what sounded like knuckles. Slow, precise knocks tracing the edges of the elevator roof. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more, each one measured, patient. I whispered again, "Is someone there?" This time the sound answered immediately. 1 sharp tap in return. Not random, not cables. Someone was listening. The darkness plays tricks on the mind. I started remembering things that didn't belong to that moment. Old stories about people trapped underground. Rescue workers who heard voices that shouldn't exist. My breathing grew uneven, and I tried to steady it by counting in my head. Every time I hit 5, another tap interrupted, syncing itself to my rhythm like it was mocking me. I held the phone tighter, its glow barely enough to see my fingers, battery at 5%. My reflection on the metal door was just a blur, a faint outline that seemed to twitch with every flicker of light. Then came a different sound. The faint creak of metal from above, followed by a low, scraping noise, almost like something being dragged. I lifted my phone toward the ceiling, squinting. For half a second, I thought I saw movement behind the vent, something shifting in the slats, just enough to catch the light before disappearing. My throat went dry. I stepped back, pressed against the wall, and tried not to make a sound. The elevator gave a subtle shudder, like it was reacting to something heavy settling on top of it. The elevator lights blinked once, just enough to show the dust swirling in the air, then died again. I gripped the railing, listening. The sound above shifted, not just tapping now, but faint scraping, as if something metallic was tracing slow circles across the roof. I tried shouting for help again, and my own voice came back distorted, bouncing off the shaft in ways that made it sound like several people were whispering the same words back at me. I hit the emergency panel again, even though I knew it was useless. Each button gave a hollow click under my fingers, but nothing lit up. A thin draft pushed through the ceiling vent, cold enough to sting my face. It carried the faintest smell of burnt plastic and oil, like an engine overheating somewhere nearby. Then came another sound, short, clipped breaths, followed by a whisper that might have been my name. I didn't want to believe that. Maybe I was hearing the wind or the echo of the cables, I backed into the corner and watched the narrow vent above me, my phone light trembling across the edges. The air seemed to hum now, like a low vibration buried beneath the silence. When the elevator shook again, it wasn't random. It moved just once, a single deliberate drop of a few inches before halting. The cables groaned under the weight, and that sound from the roof, the dragging metal, stopped completely. For a moment there was only stillness. Then a single knock came from directly above my head, followed by another, slower one on the wall beside me. I pressed my ear against the cold surface and heard something slide downward, a noise so close it felt like it was tracing my outline through the steel. I yelled for anyone in the maintenance room, anyone in the building, even the security guard I'd seen earlier at the lobby desk. Nothing came back. The air felt warmer suddenly, as if the walls were breathing with me. My phone dimmed to 1%, and the blue light barely reached the corners of the elevator. The next sound wasn't tapping or scraping. It was a quiet laugh. Not loud or mocking, just a low, broken chuckle that stopped as soon as I lifted my head. That was the last thing I heard before the light finally died. When the light vanished, I thought I'd gone deaf too. The silence wasn't empty, it was dense, pressing against my ears, making every breath feel like it belonged to someone else. I slid down the wall, clutching the phone that had become useless. My heartbeat filled the space, fast and uneven. I waited for the tapping to return, for anything to break the stillness, but the dark stayed whole. Minutes, maybe hours passed like that. I had no way of knowing. The air tasted metallic, and I could hear faint pops from the elevator's wiring cooling off. Every sound became a question. Was it me or something else? When the elevator finally moved, it was so sudden I barely had time to react. It jerked once, then began descending again, slow but steady. The lights didn't come back, but I could feel motion, that subtle pull under my feet that made my stomach tighten. Somewhere far below, I could hear the faint hum of generators. I thought I was being rescued. I remember crying out, "Hello, can anyone hear me?" No answer. The tapping didn't return either. Only the mechanical groans of the shaft as the elevator crawled downward, stopping with a gentle bump. The doors slid open into complete darkness. No lobby lights, no emergency lamps, not even the glow of street lights through the glass. I stepped out carefully, hands brushing against the cold marble wall until I found the main hallway. The building was dead silent. My shoes clicked against the floor, echoing back at me, but something about the echo wasn't right. It came a second too late, like it was chasing me. I walked faster until I reached the glass entrance. Outside, the city was pitch black. Every building, every sign, every light, gone. Only the red sky above, faint and unnatural, lit by something distant. When power finally returned, I was sitting on the curb outside, surrounded by flashing emergency lights and strangers who'd gathered from nearby buildings. No one else had been trapped in an elevator that night. When I told a firefighter what I'd heard, the knocking, the voice, the sound above, he said it was probably pressure from the cables, the kind of thing panic makes worse. But even as he spoke, I kept watching the elevator doors through the glass. They opened once more, just slightly as if breathing. Something metallic shifted inside. And for a brief moment, I swore I heard that slow, rhythmic tapping again. One last time. The night the power grid failed across Florida, I had just started what should have been a calm 12-hour shift. My name's Aaron, and at that time I was the only nurse on duty in the ICU wing of a small coastal hospital. Most of the staff had gone home early because of the storm warnings. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against the windows like it wanted in. The lights flickered twice, and then the entire world outside the glass went dark. I remember standing by the monitors, hearing every machine sigh as the power cut out, and for a second, it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The generator kicked in after a few seconds, buzzing from somewhere deep in the lower floors. The relief that washed over me was short-lived. The hum sounded strained, almost sick. We had 3 patients on life support that night: an older man recovering from heart surgery, a woman in a coma after a car accident, and a teenage boy with severe asthma complications. Their lives hung on those machines, and suddenly, I became the only thing standing between them and silence. An hour passed before the temperature began to climb. Without full ventilation, the ICU started to feel like an oven. The walls seemed to radiate heat. I tried calling the emergency line, the maintenance team, anyone. Nothing. Every call ended in static. I told myself help was on the way, that power crews were out there fixing things. But then the generator coughed once, twice, and went quiet. The machines followed one after another, their beeps stretching into a flat, suffocating line. That silence was like gravity, thick and absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, the shallow rasp of the old man's breathing, and something else, faint but rhythmic. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the main corridor. I thought maybe it was security coming to check on me, but the sound stopped right outside the ICU doors. I waited for them to open. They never did. I stayed by the door for a long moment, waiting for whoever was out there to say something. Nothing came through the glass, no shadow, no whisper, just that faint echo dying away in the hallway. The backup lights in the ceiling were out, so I grabbed my small pen light and aimed it toward the corridor. The beam reached only a few feet before being swallowed by darkness. I told myself it could be the pipes expanding in the heat or a cart rolling on its own. But it did not sound mechanical. It sounded human, someone pacing just beyond the door, stopping when I moved. When I turned back to the patients, sweat had soaked through my scrubs. The temperature kept climbing, and the air felt thick enough to choke on. I went through the supply room and found 3 portable oxygen tanks, 2 nearly full, 1 less than half. I lined them on the counter and stared at them for a long time. I had always trusted protocols, flowcharts, supervision, but there was none of that now. The emergency radio was silent, and the backup power room was several floors down. Every minute that passed meant less air for the people who could not ask for it. I decided to start with the boy. His chest barely moved, and without the ventilator, his breathing sounded fragile, like paper crumpling. I attached one of the full tanks to his mask and watched the line of his pulse steady. The old man was gasping quietly, his skin turning gray. I gave him the second tank, adjusting the flow as I had done hundreds of times before. The woman in the coma did not move at all, but her monitor showed faint electrical flickers, a heartbeat trying to stay alive. I stared at the last half-empty tank and felt my throat close up. Somewhere down the hallway, something metal clattered to the floor. It was distant but sharp, echoing through the hollow corridors. I stepped outside the ICU for a moment, shining the pen light down the empty stretch. The hospital had never felt so enormous. Wheelchairs, carts, and gurneys stood frozen in the dark, their shapes distorted by the faint red glow of emergency exit signs. The smell of antiseptic mixed with heat made me dizzy. Then, from the far end, came the slow scrape of a shoe on tile. Once, then again, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet toward me. The scraping stopped halfway down the hall, and the air seemed to thicken with every second that passed. I whispered a name, just a reflex asking if anyone was there, but only the hum of the emergency lights answered me. The idea of leaving the patients alone terrified me more than whatever might be walking those corridors. I stepped back inside and locked the ICU door. Though I doubted the thin latch would stop much, the generator room came to mind again, but the thought of navigating that dark maze alone made my stomach knot. I sat between the beds, the small beam of my pen light trembling across the walls, waiting for a sound that would tell me what to do. Hours blurred together, the oxygen gauges kept falling, and I could not shake the thought that rescue crews might never come. I rotated the tanks as best I could, giving each patient bursts of air, counting the seconds under my breath. When I pressed my ear against the wall, I could hear the faint pulse of the storm outside. Rain, wind, and maybe distant sirens too far to matter. Then the footsteps came again, slower, heavier, as if whoever it was had learned the rhythm of my movements and matched them. When the boy's oxygen ran out, his pulse line began to flatten. I tried to ration what little was left from the half-empty tank, but it only delayed the inevitable. His last breath came out as a faint whistle, and then the silence returned, deeper this time, heavier. I do not remember crying. I remember only the sound of metal turning at the ICU handle. Someone was trying to get in. I shouted that the door was locked, that I was inside with patients, but there was no response. Just the sound of the handle twitching, slow, measured, like testing the strength of the lock. Then it stopped. By sunrise, the power returned with a jolt that made every machine scream back to life. The building flooded with blinding fluorescent light, and I realized I was sitting on the floor, clutching the empty oxygen tank. The boy was gone, the other two still alive. When the maintenance team finally reached the ICU, they told me no one else had been in the building that night. Every entrance was sealed, and security cameras had been down since the blackout began. I transferred to another hospital soon after, but every time the lights flicker now, I hear those footsteps again, slow, patient, and waiting. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Fort Benning changed everything for me, though not in the way anyone expects when they sign up to serve their country. 6 months ago, I was just another recruit fresh off the bus, 19 and convinced I knew what hard work meant from helping my dad run his construction business since middle school. Basic training would break us down and build us back up, they said. Make us into soldiers, into something stronger than we were before. What they never mentioned was that sometimes the breaking down goes too far, and sometimes the people doing it aren't following any rule book except their own twisted version. I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, remembering the sound of boots on concrete at 2 in the morning, knowing what was coming next. Sergeant First Class Hartley had been at Fort Benning for 12 years when our unit arrived that September. Square jaw, perfect posture, the kind of guy whose uniform looked like it had been painted on. Never a thread out of place even after 18-hour training days. Everyone respected him immediately, the way you respect someone who clearly knows their job inside and out, and could probably run the obstacle course backwards with their eyes closed. During regular training hours, he was tough but fair, pushing us hard, but always within the boundaries of what the training manual prescribed. He had this way of making you want to impress him, like getting a nod of approval from him meant you were really becoming a soldier. Other drill sergeants would joke around with him in the mess hall, and you could tell even they looked up to him, especially the younger ones who would ask his advice about handling difficult recruits. It started small, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. Private Kowalski dropped his rifle during morning drills, fumbled it right in front of the whole platoon, and Hartley's face went dark in a way I'd never seen before. Not the usual controlled anger drills sergeants use to motivate you, but something colder, more personal. That night, around 11 when most of us were already in our bunks, Hartley appeared in the doorway and called out Kowalski's name, told him to get dressed in full gear and report to the back training grounds behind Building 7. Nobody thought much of it at first. Extra PT for screw-ups was normal, expected even. But Kowalski came back 3 hours later, could barely walk, wouldn't look anyone in the eye, just collapsed into his bunk fully clothed and faced the wall. When someone asked him what happened, he just shook his head and said Hartley was helping him become better, that he needed the correction. After that first night, it became a pattern that spread through our barracks like a disease nobody wanted to name. If you messed up during the day, really messed up in a way that caught Hartley's attention, you could expect that late-night visit. The chosen recruit would get dressed in silence while the rest of us pretended to sleep, though every single one of us was wide awake, listening to the footsteps fade down the hallway. They'd come back hours later, some limping, some holding their ribs, all of them with that same hollow look in their eyes. We started calling them corrective sessions among ourselves, whispered conversations in the shower blocks where we figured the noise of running water would cover our voices. One kid from Alabama, Private Jennings, tried to refuse once, said he was going to report it to the battalion commander, but Hartley just smiled and reminded him that going outside the chain of command was a serious offense, and besides, who would believe a struggling recruit over a decorated sergeant with 12 years of spotless service? My turn came on a Wednesday in October, about 6 weeks into training. During live fire exercises, I'd hesitated before throwing a practice grenade, held it a second too long while my brain processed the weight of what I was doing, and Hartley saw everything. He didn't say anything at the time, just made a note on his clipboard, but I knew what was coming. Sure enough, at exactly midnight, I heard those boots coming down the hall, each step measured and deliberate like he was savoring the anticipation. When he appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting, he didn't even need to say my name, just pointed at me and then at the door. I got dressed with numb fingers, laced my boots tight, and followed him out into the Georgia night where the air was thick with humidity, and the crickets had gone silent, like even they knew to be afraid. Building 7 sat at the edge of the base, an old warehouse they used for storing equipment that hadn't been updated since Vietnam. Behind it was a dirt clearing surrounded by tall pines that blocked any view from the main base. The ground worn smooth from what I now realized were years of these sessions. Hartley had me start with push-ups, nothing unusual there, except he made me do them with my feet elevated on a crate while he placed his boot on my back, adding pressure every time I went down until my arms were shaking so bad I could barely hold myself up. When I finally collapsed, face first into the dirt, he grabbed me by the collar and hauled me up, told me weakness like mine got soldiers killed, got whole units killed, and he was going to fix me whether I liked it or not. For the next 2 hours, he put me through exercises I'd never seen in any manual, making me hold stress positions until my muscles cramped and locked up, bear crawling through the dirt while he kicked at my ribs if I slowed down, standing at attention while he screamed questions in my face about why I thought I deserved to wear the uniform, when I couldn't even throw a grenade properly. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was bad enough that I threw up twice and he made me keep going anyway, told me to swallow it down like a real soldier. It was the way he knew exactly how far to push without leaving marks that would raise questions during morning PT. A bruised rib here, a strained muscle there, nothing that wouldn't look like normal training injuries to anyone who didn't know better. He had it down to a science, probably perfected over years of doing this to recruits who thought they had nowhere else to turn. When he finally let me go, he grabbed my face with one hand, fingers digging into my jaw, and told me this was between us, that I should be grateful he cared enough to give me personal attention when most sergeants would just let me fail. Then he mentioned almost casually that Private Thompson from the previous training cycle had tried to file a complaint once, and wasn't it sad how he'd had that training accident that got him medically discharged before he could graduate. 3 days later, everything changed when Private Nguyen collapsed during one of Hartley's sessions and didn't get back up. We found out later from a guy who worked in medical that Nguyen had suffered kidney damage from dehydration and repeated blunt force trauma to his lower back, though the official report just said heat exhaustion and overexertion during voluntary additional training. They medevaced him out that same night, and by morning his bunk had been stripped and his name removed from all the rosters like he'd never existed. But that's when we started talking to each other for real, comparing notes in hushed conversations during equipment cleaning, and realized this had been going on for years. One recruit remembered his older brother mentioning something about a crazy sergeant at Benning who did special training back in 2016. Another had heard rumors from guys in different units about avoiding Hartley's attention at all costs. What really made my gut churn was when Private Foster, who had a cousin working admin at battalion headquarters, told us what he'd learned during a family day visit. Apparently, Hartley wasn't acting alone, and that was the scariest part of all. There were at least 3 senior officers who knew exactly what was happening behind Building 7, including Major Brennan and Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, and they'd been rotating Hartley between training companies every few years to avoid too many complaints building up in one place. Foster's cousin had seen requisitions for medical supplies that went specifically to Building 7. Off-the-book stuff that never appeared in any official inventory. Bandages and ice packs and prescription painkillers that Hartley would use to patch up recruits just enough to make it through the next day's training. They had a whole system in place, documented in folders that weren't supposed to exist, tracking which recruits had been through sessions and making sure none of them ended up in the same unit after graduation, where they might compare stories. We tried to be smart about it, gathered evidence where we could, took photos of bruises in the latrine mirrors using a contraband phone someone had hidden in the ventilation grate. Private Coleman started writing down dates and times in a notebook he kept inside his pillowcase, documenting who got called out and what condition they came back in. But they were watching us too, and I think Hartley could smell the rebellion brewing in our unit like blood in the water. He started calling multiple recruits at once for sessions, making us watch each other go through the exercises, forcing us to hold each other down or add weight to the stress positions, turning us against ourselves so we couldn't unite against him. One night he had 5 of us out there, and when Private Reese refused to put his knee on Private Gordon's back during push-ups, Hartley made all of us low crawl through the mud for an hour until Reese finally broke and did what he was told, crying the whole time while Gordon gasped underneath him. The breaking point came during week 9 when Private Foster, the one whose cousin worked in admin, decided he'd had enough and went straight to the Criminal Investigation Division office on base. He walked in there with Coleman's notebook, the phone with all our photos, and bruises still fresh on his ribs from the night before. 6 hours later, Foster was gone, transferred to another base for family emergency reasons, and Hartley called a special formation just for our barracks. He stood there in front of us, hands clasped behind his back, and talked about how training accidents were such unfortunate things, how sometimes recruits who couldn't handle the pressure made up stories to avoid facing their own failures. He never mentioned Foster by name, but he didn't have to. We all knew what had happened. That night, nobody got called for a session, but nobody slept either. Just lay there in the dark wondering if we'd ever make it to graduation, or if we'd all end up mysteriously transferred or medically discharged before we could tell anyone what really went on behind Building 7. But Foster had been smarter than any of us realized, because before he went to CID, he'd mailed copies of everything to his father, a retired command sergeant major who still had connections all the way up the chain. 2 weeks later, the base was suddenly crawling with investigators from outside Fort Benning, people Hartley and his protectors couldn't control or intimidate. They pulled each of us in for interviews one by one, and this time when we talked, people actually listened and wrote things down in official reports that couldn't just disappear. Hartley was relieved of duty pending investigation, and watching him walk off base in civilian clothes instead of his pristine uniform was like watching a demon lose its power. Major Brennan retired quietly a month later. Walsh got transferred to a desk job in Pentagon, where he couldn't hurt anyone, and 3 other sergeants we didn't even know were involved got brought up on charges. The investigation found 17 years' worth of incidents, hundreds of recruits who'd been through those sessions, dozens who'd been seriously injured and silenced. Some of them came forward after hearing about the investigation, guys who were now stationed all over the world but still woke up in cold sweats remembering Building 7. They gave us all medical evaluations and psych assessments, and I spent 6 months in therapy learning how to sleep through the night again without hearing those boots in the hallway. I finished my training with a different unit, became a soldier the right way, the way it was supposed to happen all along, but I still can't walk past a building like that warehouse without feeling my chest get tight and my palms start to sweat, wondering who else is out there using their authority to break people down with nobody watching. Nobody stopping them until someone finally finds the courage to speak up. "40 pounds of medical supplies on my back, and I still didn't have enough bandages for what was coming. Forward operating base. Ridgeline had been my home for almost a month, carved into the mountainside like a concrete tumor overlooking 3 villages that hadn't asked for our help. Command called it a humanitarian stabilization effort, which sounded noble enough when you're sitting in an air-conditioned briefing room stateside. Up here, at 8,000 feet, where the wind could strip paint off vehicles and the locals watched us through cracked windows, those words meant something else entirely. 2 years out of medical training at Fort Campbell, and here I was, 24 and playing combat medic in a place where combat was supposedly over. My friends from high school were posting pictures of their new apartments and complaining about their bosses on social media. My boss carried an M4 and had a habit of reviewing casualty reports while cleaning his sidearm. Captain Morrison ran our unit like clockwork, which should have been reassuring but wasn't. Every morning, briefing followed the same script: hearts and minds, building trust, showing the locals we were here to help. He'd stand there with his clipboard, marking off daily objectives like we were running a grocery store instead of an armed outpost. My medical station was supposed to be the crown jewel of our presence here, proof that we brought healing instead of harm. Those first few weeks I actually believed it. Treated mostly respiratory infections in kids whose lungs couldn't handle the dust we kicked up with our vehicles. Set broken bones for farmers who'd fallen working their terraced fields. Distributed antibiotics like candy on Halloween. Morrison would stop by every evening to review my patient logs, nodding approvingly at the numbers, always reminding me to document everything properly for the reports that went up the chain. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in my 4th week. I was organizing supplies, counting gauze packets for the 3rd time, because the numbers never seemed to match our requisitions, when I heard the commotion outside. 2 of our guys, Corporal Vance and Private Holloway, were hauling someone through the gates. At first, I thought it was one of ours, the way they were supporting him between them. But as they got closer to the medical station's lights, I saw it was a local man, maybe 40. His traditional clothes torn and stained with something dark. They dropped him on my examination table without a word, and Vance just said, "Fix him up, Doc," before walking out. That's when I got my first real look at his injuries. Ligature marks around his wrists, deep enough to leave grooves in the skin, bruising across his ribs in a pattern I recognized from textbooks but had never seen in person, the kind you get from systematic beating with something rigid in uniform, like a baton. The man wouldn't tell me his name, just kept repeating something in Pashto that I didn't understand, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds like he expected someone to come finish what they'd started. His breathing was labored, but not from any respiratory condition. It was fear, pure and simple, the kind that makes your chest tight and your hands tremble. I cleaned and dressed his wounds, documented everything in my official log with the kind of neutral medical language that strips humanity from injury. Contusions, multiple sites, abrasions consistent with restraint, careful not to speculate about cause in writing. While I worked, I noticed other things. His fingernails had dirt packed beneath them like he'd been clawing at something, trying to dig his way out. There was a number written on the back of his hand in black marker, 47, like someone had been keeping track, organizing, systematizing whatever had happened to him. I gave him water and some pain medication, watched him drink with shaky hands that could barely hold the cup steady. After about an hour, when the morphine had taken the edge off his pain, he finally spoke a few words in broken English. "Not fighter," he said, pointing to himself. "Teacher. Just teacher." He pulled out a crumpled ID card from his pocket, the photo showing him clean-shaven and smiling, standing in front of a chalkboard covered in mathematical equations. The contrast between that photo and the broken man on my table made something twist in my gut. Before I could ask him anything else, Sergeant Brooks appeared in the doorway, told me the patient was cleared for release. When I protested that he needed observation, possible x-rays for the rib injuries, Brooks just looked at me with this flat expression and said, Morrison wanted him gone by dawn. The teacher understood enough English to know what that meant. He was on his feet and stumbling toward the door before I could even grab his arm to steady him. That should have been my first warning, the moment I should have started asking real questions, but I told myself it was an isolated incident. Maybe he'd been caught up in something, wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe our guys had made a mistake in the dark. You tell yourself these things because the alternative means accepting that everything you're doing here is a lie. But then Wednesday night came, and they brought in 3 more. Same kinds of injuries, same numbered hands, 48, 49, 50. One was a teenager, couldn't have been older than 16, with electrical burns on his shoulders that formed perfect circles, the kind you get from direct application of current through metal contacts. His uncle was with him, number 49, missing 2 fingernails and with a shoulder that hung wrong, dislocated and left untreated for hours. The third was an elderly woman who wouldn't stop crying, not from pain but from something else, something that had broken inside her that no amount of medical treatment could fix. I was wrapping the teenager's burns when Morrison himself walked into my station, something he rarely did after dark. He stood there watching me work, his hands clasped behind his back like he was inspecting troops on parade. These individuals were detained during routine security operations, he said, using that bureaucratic voice that turned people into paperwork. They've been processed and cleared. Your job is medical treatment, nothing more. I kept my eyes on the gauze I was wrapping, asked him what kind of security operation leaves electrical burns on a kid who probably wasn't even shaving yet. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath, the gun oil on his uniform. Specialist, he said, and the way he said my rank made it sound like a threat. You're here to provide medical assistance. That's your lane, stay in it. After he left, the teenager grabbed my wrist with his good hand, pulled me down close enough to whisper. His English was better than he'd let on in front of Morrison. They come at night, he said, words tumbling out fast and desperate. Take men from houses. Say we hide weapons, hide fighters. We hide nothing. My father, they took him 3 days ago. Number 31, he never came back. His uncle tried to shush him, terrified even in the relative safety of my medical station. But the kid kept talking. They have room in basement, under old school. They take us there, ask questions we cannot answer because we don't know. They write numbers so they know who talked, who didn't talk, who broke. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we didn't do things like that. But the evidence was right there under my hands, burned into his skin in perfect methodical circles. Thursday morning's briefing was like every other, Morrison going through his checklist while the squad leaders nodded along. I sat in the back, my coffee going cold in my hands, watching him discuss supply routes and patrol schedules like we hadn't been torturing civilians in the basement of an abandoned school. When he dismissed us, I followed him to his office, shut the door behind me. Sir, about the patients coming in at night, I started, but he cut me off with a raised hand. Those are enemy combatants who've been processed according to protocol, he said, not even looking up from his laptop. I told him about the teacher, the teenager, asked him how a math teacher qualified as an enemy combatant. That's when he finally looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my mouth go dry. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was calculation, like he was solving a problem, and I was a variable that wasn't fitting into his equation. Specialist, he said, leaning back in his chair. You're a good medic, one of the best we've had up here. Your reports are thorough, your treatment success rate is exceptional, but you're young. You don't understand the complexities of counterinsurgency operations. He pulled out a folder from his desk, thick with papers, and set it between us. Every individual we detain is identified through intelligence gathering, phone intercepts, human intelligence, pattern analysis. That teacher you're so concerned about, his cousin's neighbor's son joined the militants 6 months ago. The teenager? His uncle's phone number was found in a dead fighter's contacts. These connections run deep, and sometimes we have to apply pressure to find where the threats are hiding. He tapped the folder with his index finger. This is bigger than your medical station, bigger than this outpost. This is about preventing the next bombing in a marketplace full of families, the next ambush that kills 18-year-old privates from Kansas and Ohio. I left his office knowing 2 things. They weren't going to stop, and I was now a problem that needed solving. That night I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the numbers, about how systematic it all was, how many people had passed through that basement before ending up on my table, or not ending up anywhere at all. Around 0200 hours, I heard vehicles leaving the base, the familiar rumble of Humvees heading down into the valley. I knew what that meant. Knew that in a few hours I'd have more numbered hands to bandage, more electrical burns to treat, more broken people to patch up just enough so they could be broken again. I got up, started preparing my supplies, laying out everything I'd need for trauma treatment: gauze, antiseptic, morphine, suture kits. The routine of it was almost comforting, gave my hands something to do while my mind raced through options that all led to the same dead end. By Oro 400, they were back. This time it was 7 people, numbers 51 through 57, and among them was a kid who couldn't have been more than 12. Number 54. His crime, according to the processing sheet Corporal Vance dropped on my desk, was suspected courier activities. The boy had a concussion, pupils uneven, responding slowly to light, the kind of head trauma you get from being slammed against something hard, repeatedly. While I was checking him for skull fractures, Morrison appeared in the doorway again, but this time he wasn't alone. Master Sergeant Kane was with him, a man who never came to the medical station, who most of us only saw during major operations. Kane had been in Afghanistan since the beginning, had that 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much and caring too little. "Specialist," Morrison said, his voice different now, colder. "We need to discuss your recent performance evaluations." It was a threat dressed up as bureaucracy, and we all knew it. Kane just stood there, hand resting casually on his sidearm, like we were having a normal conversation at a normal hour with normal people instead of a room full of tortured civilians. "Your rotation ends in 6 days, Morrison continued, checking his watch like the time mattered. "You'll be on the convoy back to Bagram, then stateside for leave. I'm sure you're looking forward to seeing your family, getting back to normal life." The way he emphasized normal made it clear what he meant. Forget what you've seen, keep your mouth shut, move on. Kane shifted slightly, his hand still on his weapon, and I understood the message completely. They had 6 more days to decide if I was going to be a problem that required a more permanent solution. The 12-year-old on my table moaned, trying to sit up, and Morrison's eyes flicked to him briefly before returning to me. "Of course, convoy routes can be dangerous. IEDs, ambushes, sometimes people don't make it to Bagram." He let that hang in the air between us, the implicit threat as clear as the numbered hands I was treating. "Do your job, specialist. Treat the patients, file your reports, and in 6 days you go home. That's all you need to focus on." After they left, I finished treating the boy and the others, working in silence while my mind processed what had just happened. They were giving me an out, but it came with conditions. Complicity through silence. 6 days of patching up torture victims. 6 days of pretending not to know what those numbers meant. 6 days of being part of a machine that ground up innocent people and spit out intelligence that probably wasn't even real. The boy's uncle came to help him walk out, and as they left, the man looked back at me with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of justice, just the resigned acceptance of someone who knew this was how the world worked now. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that this wasn't what we were supposed to be, but what good would that do? I kept my mouth shut, cleaned my station, filed my reports with the same sanitized language that turned atrocities into medical procedures. 6 days. I made it through those 6 days by shutting down everything inside me that knew right from wrong, by becoming exactly what Morrison needed me to be, a cog in his machine, silent and efficient. On the morning of day 7, I was on that convoy to Bagram, and 3 weeks later, I was home. I never reported what I saw, never filed complaints, never spoke up. The official records show a successful humanitarian mission, hearts and minds won, medical aid delivered to grateful civilians. Sometimes I Google the names of places near that outpost looking for news, for any sign of what happened after I left. But there's nothing. It's like it never happened at all, except for the numbers I still see when I close my eyes. 31, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51 through 57, and all the ones that came after that are probably still coming. "12 years in the Army, and I walked away right before making staff sergeant, something my old squad still doesn't understand. I let them think what they want, because the real reason isn't something I can explain over beers at the VFW. What happened in that village near the Guatemalan border in early 2018 changed everything about how I see the world. I was 30 then, stationed at a small outpost in southern Mexico as part of a joint task force nobody talks about anymore. We were there, unofficially, helping the Mexican army track cartel movements through the jungle highlands. Most days were boring as hell, sitting in humid tents, monitoring radio chatter, eating MREs that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret. The kind of assignment where you count mosquito bites for entertainment and argue about whether the local water would kill you faster than a bullet. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Lieutenant Crawford called 6 of us into the command tent. Intel had picked up unusual activity in a village about 8 miles north, a place the locals called Piedra Negra. Satellite footage showed armed men moving through at night, possibly using it as a way station for moving product north. Crawford wanted eyes on the ground before committing to any larger operation. Simple recon, he said, in and out, 12 hours max. Me, Specialist Miller, Private First Class Dobson, Corporal Ramirez, Sergeant First Class Briggs, and Staff Sergeant Norton would hike in after dark, set up observation posts, and radio back what we found. I remember joking with Miller about finally getting some action after weeks of swatting mosquitoes. If I could go back and grab myself by the shoulders, tell myself to fake sick, break my own leg, anything to avoid that patrol, I would. We left at 2100 hours, moving single file through the jungle with night vision that turned everything into shades of green static. Norton took point, then Briggs, me, Miller, Dobson, and Ramirez bringing up the rear. The humidity was like breathing through wet cloth, and every step squelched in the muddy undergrowth. About 2 hours in, we hit our first waypoint, a ridge overlooking the valley where Piedra Negra sat like a cluster of dark squares against darker forest. Norton hand-signaled for us to spread out and establish our observation posts. I set up with Miller behind a fallen tree trunk, its bark crawling with insects that glowed white in the night vision. Through my scope, I could see cooking fires in the village, maybe 15 structures total. Most of them simple concrete blocks with corrugated metal roofs. At 23:47 hours, Norton's voice crackled through the radio, saying he had movement on the north side of the village. Then Briggs confirmed, counting at least 12 individuals moving between buildings. I was adjusting my scope for a better view when the transmission cut into static. Not unusual in the mountains, but the timing made my neck prickle. Miller tried raising Norton on the backup frequency while I swept my scope across the village. The cooking fires were out now, and I couldn't spot any of the movement Norton had reported, just empty paths between dark buildings. Then Miller grabbed my shoulder, pointed to our 10 o'clock position. Through the trees, maybe 50 meters away, I saw them, 2 figures in tactical gear, moving low and fast toward Dobson's position. The way they moved, the equipment profile, these weren't cartel fighters. These were trained soldiers, and they were wearing our exact same kit. Miller and I exchanged looks through our night vision, that green-tinted moment of recognition that something was deeply wrong. I tried to raise Dobson on the radio, got nothing but dead air. The 2 figures had stopped now, taking cover behind trees, their weapons raised toward Dobson's position. I could see the distinctive outline of M4 carbines, the same weapons we carried. Miller tapped my shoulder twice, our signal for potential friendly fire situation. But these couldn't be friendlies. We were the only American unit operating in this sector, and the Mexican army used different gear entirely. I watched one of them pull something from their vest, and my gut clenched when I recognized the shape of a fragmentation grenade. Before I could key the radio to warn Dobson, the figure hurled it in a perfect arc toward his hide. The explosion lit up my night vision in a blinding white flash. Dobson's scream cut through the jungle for maybe 2 seconds before gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Not random cartel spray and pray, but controlled bursts, disciplined fire patterns I'd heard 1,000 times on the range. Miller was already returning fire while I tried desperately to reach anyone on the radio. Through the chaos, I heard Ramirez yelling in Spanish, then in English, then just screaming. More explosions, more muzzle flashes. But in the strobing light and shadow, I couldn't tell who was shooting at who. Miller pulled me down just as rounds cracked over our heads, splitting bark from the tree we'd been using for cover. I caught a glimpse of another figure sprinting between trees. Same height and build as Norton, same way of carrying his rifle, but Norton's position was 300 meters in the opposite direction. Then I heard Briggs's voice, clear as day, shouting, "Contact left!" Except Briggs's position had gone silent 5 minutes ago. Miller grabbed my vest and yanked me backward into a small depression in the ground, just as another grenade detonated where we'd been seconds before. Mud and vegetation rained down on us. In the ringing aftermath, I heard bootsteps, multiple sets, converging on our position from 3 sides. Miller was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, trying to clear his weapon that had jammed with mud. I peeked over the edge of our hole and saw them clearly for the first time. 6 figures in perfect formation, moving with textbook squad tactics. Under the night vision, I could make out unit patches on their shoulders, the same patches we wore. One turned slightly and I swear I was looking at Ramirez's face, except Ramirez was supposed to be 200 meters behind us. The figure raised his weapon toward our position, and I saw his finger move to the trigger. We ran. No tactical withdrawal, no covering fire, just pure panic-driven flight through the jungle. Branches tore at our gear. Roots sent us stumbling, but we kept moving because the alternative was dying in that green-tinted nightmare. Behind us, voices called out using our own call signs, our own tactical language, but with something wrong in the cadence, like an echo that arrives too soon. I could hear them pursuing, not crashing through the brush like we were, but moving with impossible coordination through terrain that should have slowed anyone down. Miller went down hard, his ankle catching in a root system. When I turned to help him up, he was staring past me with his mouth open. I followed his gaze and saw Norton standing 20 feet away, rifle at low ready. The problem was, I'd just heard Norton's voice on the radio 30 seconds ago, calling for backup from his original position a half-kilometer north. This, Norton smiled, and there was something in that expression that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Miller scrambled to his feet and we bolted in different directions without a word. Some primal instinct telling us that staying together meant both dying. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, crashing through undergrowth, sliding down ravines, splashing through streams. Every shadow could have been one of them. Every sound might have been boots behind me. My radio kept crackling with fragments of conversation, my team members calling out positions, requesting support, confirming kills, but the voices overlapped wrong, like multiple people speaking with the same voice at the same time. At one point, I heard my own call sign repeated 3 times in my own voice even though I hadn't keyed the mic. I ripped the radio from my vest and threw it into the jungle. Better to be alone and silent than connected to whatever was happening on those frequencies. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle just rotating without stopping, so I navigated by keeping the slope of the mountain to my left, figuring it would lead me back toward our base eventually. Dawn was breaking when I literally stumbled into a Mexican army patrol near a logging road. I must have looked insane, covered in mud, gear torn, eyes wild, babbling in broken Spanish about American soldiers shooting at American soldiers. They zip-tied my hands at first, thought I might be a deserter or worse. It took 3 hours and a call to our liaison officer before they agreed to drive me back to our outpost. During that ride, bouncing in the back of their truck, I kept checking the faces of the Mexican soldiers, making sure they stayed the same people, that their features didn't shift when I looked away. When we reached the base, Lieutenant Crawford was waiting with 2 MPs. His first question wasn't about the mission or the village. He asked, very specifically, if I had seen any other members of my team return. When I said no, his jaw tightened in a way that told me I wasn't the first survivor to make it back. They put me in isolation for 48 hours. Standard procedure, they said, for personnel returning from compromised operations. But through the tent walls I could hear other voices, other survivors being brought in. Miller arrived 12 hours after me, covered in cuts and speaking in whispers. Ramirez showed up the next morning, missing his gear, and unable to stop talking about seeing himself die. Norton came in last, 36 hours after the mission started, perfectly clean, all his equipment intact, claiming he'd been at his observation post the entire time and didn't understand why everyone had broken radio discipline. The investigators who debriefed us compared our stories like they were trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from different boxes. Our GPS trackers showed impossible data, team members in multiple locations simultaneously, paths that looped back on themselves, positions that placed us inside solid rock. The satellite footage from that night was corrupted, showing only static during the crucial hours. Shell casings recovered from the area matched our weapons, but ballistics suggested trajectories that would have required shooters to be in physically impossible positions. What haunts me most isn't the official report that classified the whole thing as a blue-on-blue incident caused by equipment failure and environmental factors. It's not even the medical discharge they gave me after I refused to bunk with other soldiers, insisting on sleeping alone with my back to a wall. What keeps me up at night is Miller's question, asked in a whisper during our last conversation before they separated us for good. How do we know which ones of us made it back? Because here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. We lost 6 men on that patrol, but 7 survivors returned to base. The investigators knew it, Crawford knew it, and we knew it. The math didn't work, but everyone was too afraid to say it out loud. They transferred us all to different units within a week, scattered us across different bases, different countries even. I never saw any of them again, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes I catch myself in the mirror and wonder if I'm the one who didn't belong, if somewhere out there the real me is still running through that jungle. The Army gave me an honorable discharge and a monthly check to never talk about Piedra Negra, but silence doesn't stop the dreams where I'm shooting at myself in the dark. Captain Mercer just made Major, and 2 more soldiers are in the hospital because of him. My old squad mate called yesterday with the news, and I punched a hole through my apartment wall before I even realized what I was doing. 6 years have passed since Fort Irwin, since Jimmy Vasquez died in that desert, and that psychopath is still out there running training ops like nothing ever happened. I've kept my mouth shut for too long, signed their papers, took their threats seriously when they said my career would be over if I didn't play ball. But hearing about those kids in the hospital brought everything flooding back, and somebody needs to know what really went down that night in the Mojave, before more soldiers end up dead. August 2017 was hotter than Satan's armpit at Fort Irwin, with temperatures hitting 115 during the day and barely dropping below 90 at night. Our unit was there for a month of desert warfare training, mostly navigation drills and patrol exercises that should have been routine for a group of infantry guys who'd already deployed twice. Jimmy Vasquez was 22, this wisecracking kid from El Paso, who somehow managed to keep morale up even when we were all slowly losing our minds from exhaustion and dehydration. He'd enlisted right after his high school graduation in 2013, same year as me, and we'd been tight ever since we ended up in the same platoon at Fort Stewart. Kid had this thing where he'd carry twice the water he needed in his ruck, not because he was worried about himself, but because he knew somebody would run out and he wanted to be ready to help. That particular Monday started wrong from the jump when Mercer showed up to morning formation wearing his full combat gear in that heat, expecting us to be impressed or intimidated or some combination of both. He had this way of standing with his chest pushed out and his jaw clenched, like he was posing for a recruiting poster, except his eyes were always moving, always calculating who he could push and how far. First Sergeant Blackwood stood behind him looking uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and I remember thinking something was up because Blackwood was old school, the kind of NCO who'd been in since Desert Storm, and usually didn't let officers pull stupid stunts without at least trying to talk them down. But Mercer had everyone walking on eggshells after what happened to Staff Sergeant Novak the week before, when he'd questioned why we were doing land nav at noon instead of starting before dawn like the training schedule originally said, and suddenly found himself transferred to some supply unit in Kentucky within 72 hours. Mercer announced we'd be doing a 20-kilometer movement to our night navigation point, full combat load, no resupply until we reached the objective. The weather report had heat warnings all week, saying to avoid strenuous outdoor activity between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. But there was Mercer at 11:30 in the morning, telling us to gear up while the sun turned the sand into a frying pan. Jimmy raised his hand during the briefing, asked if we could at least take extra water since we'd be moving through the hottest part of the day, and Mercer's face went from its normal shade of sunburned pink to this deep purple color. He walked right up to Jimmy, close enough that their noses almost touched, and said real quiet but loud enough for everyone to hear that maybe Vasquez needed to spend some time thinking about whether he had what it took to be a warrior or if he should transfer to the Air Force where they had air conditioning. After the briefing, Mercer pulled Jimmy aside and told him since he was so concerned about water, he could carry the squad's radio too, an extra 25 pounds of equipment in that heat. I watched Jimmy's face when he got that news, saw him bite down on his bottom lip the way he did when he was trying not to say something that would get him in deeper trouble. Specialist Carson tried to volunteer to take the radio instead, said he was the RTO anyway, so it made sense. But Mercer shut him down with a look that could have peeled paint. We all knew what was happening because we'd seen it before with other guys who'd questioned Mercer's decisions. This systematic breaking down of anyone who didn't worship the ground he walked on. Except this time, we were about to march into the desert during the worst heat of the summer with a pissed-off captain looking to prove a point. We stepped off at noon sharp, the sun directly overhead turning our helmets into little ovens that cooked our brains while we walked. Within the first hour, 3 guys had already fallen back to the rear of the formation, their faces red as tomatoes, and their uniforms soaked through with sweat that dried into white salt stains before it could even drip off. Jimmy was up front with Mercer, carrying his regular kit plus that radio, and I could see him adjusting the straps every few minutes, trying to find a position that didn't cut off circulation to his arms. The sand was so hot it melted the soles of our boots where the glue held them together, and every step felt like walking through an oven that someone had filled with quicksand. Mercer kept increasing the pace, calling out cadence like we were on some motivational run back at Garrison, instead of a death march through the Mojave, and when Private First Class Hendricks stumbled and went down to one knee, Mercer made the whole platoon do 50 push-ups right there in the sand, while screaming about how weakness was contagious. By hour 3, Jimmy had stopped talking completely, which should have been everyone's first warning sign because that kid never shut up. Always had some joke or story to keep spirits up even in the worst conditions. His face had gone from red to this weird grayish color, and he was swaying with each step like a drunk person trying to walk a straight line. I tried to catch up to him, wanted to take that radio off his back or at least give him some of my water, but Mercer kept me in my position, said any more disruptions to the formation would result in Article 15s for everyone involved. Specialist Washington whispered to me that he'd seen Jimmy dump out his last water bottle an hour ago, completely empty, and now he was just gutting it out on pure willpower and fear of what Mercer would do if he fell out of formation. The sun was starting to set when it happened, that golden hour light making everything look peaceful and beautiful, like some kind of sick joke while we were all dying inside. Jimmy took 3 more steps, then his legs just gave out like someone had cut his strings, and he went down hard, face first into the sand with all that gear on top of him. The radio made this awful crunching sound when he hit, and for a second nobody moved because Mercer had trained us so well not to break formation without permission. Then training kicked in, and me and Carson rushed to flip him over, get his helmet off, start checking his vitals while someone else called for the medic on their radio. Jimmy's eyes were rolled back in his head. His skin was dry and burning hot to the touch. No sweat at all, which meant his body had completely given up trying to cool itself down. And when I tried to find a pulse, it was going so fast, it felt like a hummingbird trapped under his skin. Mercer stood over us while we worked on Jimmy. Not helping, not calling for faster medical support, just watching with this expression on his face that I'll never forget, like he was disappointed Jimmy had proven him right about being weak. He actually said, and I quote this word for word because it's burned into my memory, that this was what happened when soldiers didn't maintain proper physical fitness standards and tried to take shortcuts. Carson looked up at him with pure hatred in his eyes and said, "Sir, Vasquez ran a perfect PFT last month, 300 score, and Mercer just shrugged and said heat casualties were usually pre-existing conditions that the Army didn't catch during recruitment. The medic was still nowhere to be seen, and when Washington tried calling again, we found out they were positioned at the finish point, 20 minutes away by vehicle on rough terrain, because Mercer hadn't wanted them slowing down the movement by being embedded with us. We tried everything we knew from our combat lifesaver training while waiting for that medic. Poured what little water we had left on Jimmy's neck and armpits, elevated his legs, fanned him with anything we could find. But his body was too far gone into heat stroke. His breathing got shallower and shallower, these tiny little gasps like a fish out of water, and then it just stopped altogether right as we heard the medical vehicle's engine in the distance. Carson started chest compressions immediately, while I gave rescue breaths, counting out loud to keep rhythm. But Jimmy's lips were already turning blue despite the heat, and his pupils were fixed and dilated when I checked them with my flashlight. The medics took over when they arrived, shot him full of drugs and continued CPR all the way to the medical station. But we all knew he was gone, had been gone probably since before they even got there, killed by one man's ego and need to prove his authority. They pronounced Jimmy dead at the medical station 45 minutes later. Official cause listed as heat stroke, with complications from a previously undiagnosed heart condition, which was complete bullshit because Jimmy had just passed his physical 2 months before with flying colors. Within hours, Criminal Investigation Division showed up, but not to investigate Mercer, no. They came to interview us about whether Vasquez had been drinking the night before, if he'd been taking any supplements, if maybe he'd been hiding some medical issue from the command. Mercer had already gotten his story straight with the battalion commander, painted this picture of a young soldier who'd pushed himself beyond his limits despite repeated warnings to hydrate and rest, completely reversing what actually happened. When me and Carson tried to tell them about the punishment with the extra gear, about Mercer refusing to let anyone help Jimmy when he was struggling, about the medics being deliberately positioned too far away, we got pulled aside by First Sergeant Blackwood, who told us in very clear terms that our version of events didn't match the official report, and maybe we were suffering from heat exhaustion ourselves, confused about what we remembered. They shipped Jimmy's body home to El Paso in a flag-draped coffin, told his mother her son was a hero who died serving his country, never mentioned that his death was completely preventable, that he'd been targeted and punished for having the audacity to ask for extra water in 115-degree heat. Most of us from the platoon pooled money to send flowers to the funeral, but we weren't allowed to attend because we were still in training, still under Mercer's command for another 2 weeks of hell, where he made sure to remind us daily that weak soldiers got themselves killed. 3 guys went AWOL after that, just disappeared into the desert one night rather than spend another day under that monster's command, and honestly, I understood why. The rest of us kept our heads down, graduated the training, and scattered to different units as fast as we could, but not before Mercer made sure our evaluation reports mentioned we had difficulty performing under stress and questioned leadership decisions, career-killing bullets that followed most of us for years. I got out in 2022 after my second contract ended. Couldn't stomach the idea of staying in an organization that protected people like Mercer, while good kids like Jimmy got buried with lies. Carson left a year before me, works construction now in Colorado. Still has nightmares about that day according to his wife who reached out to me on Facebook last Christmas. Washington stayed in, but transferred to the National Guard. Said he couldn't do active duty anymore after what happened. We tried one more time to get someone to listen in 2019 when a senator's office was investigating training deaths, sent them everything we had, including photos we'd taken that day showing the conditions, the timeline, even a recording Washington had made on his phone of Mercer, berating Jimmy during the march. But nothing came of it because Mercer had connections, golf buddies with stars on their shoulders, who made sure his record stayed clean. Now he's Major Mercer, probably on track to make Lieutenant Colonel within a few years, still running soldiers into the ground in Nevada, and all I can do is post this story on every military forum I can find, hoping maybe someone with more power than me will finally do something. Jimmy's mom still texts me on his birthday every year, Tells me about his sisters who all graduated college now, how proud he would have been of them. And every time I have to swallow the guilt of not doing more, not pushing harder, not finding some way to get justice for her son. But maybe if enough people read this, if enough people know what really happened to Private First Class James Vasquez on August 14, 2017, maybe the next kid who questions an illegal order in dangerous conditions won't end up in a box, and maybe someday Mercer will finally face consequences for what he did, though I'm not holding my breath because the system protects its own, always has, always will. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 12 hours under a Humvee in the middle of winter, and that night, I had it bad. I'm a specialist in the Army, stationed out west, and I'd been pulling double shifts at the motor pool ever since my deployment orders came through. My 26th birthday had passed 3 weeks earlier, celebrated with a gas station sandwich between vehicle inspections, and I was still grinding through the pre-deployment checklist that seemed to grow longer every day. That particular Friday in March 2023, I didn't leave post until 11:15, my hands raw from handling frozen metal all day, and my back screaming from being twisted into positions the human spine was never meant to hold. The drive home took me along Route 115, this desolate stretch of two-lane highway that cuts through about 40 miles of absolutely nothing. Most nights I'd have music going or a podcast to keep my brain engaged, but my phone had died around hour 10 of my shift, and I'd left my car charger in my other vehicle. So it was just me in the road, with maybe 3 or 4 cars passing the entire trip. The highway dips and curves through these rolling plains where you can go 10 miles without seeing a single light. And about 20 miles from post, right where the terrain drops into this wide valley, the fatigue hit me like a brick. My eyelids felt like they had weights attached, and I caught myself drifting across the center line twice in 5 minutes. When I spotted the gravel turnout ahead, just this little semicircle of packed dirt off the shoulder, I knew I needed to stop before I wrapped my car around a guardrail. I pulled in and killed the engine, letting my head fall back against the seat. The silence was immediate and total, the kind you only get in the middle of nowhere with no wind and no traffic. I set a timer on my watch for 15 minutes, figuring that would be enough to reset my brain without falling into actual sleep. My water bottle was in the back seat, still half full from that morning, and the first sip of it was warm and plastic tasting, but I didn't care. I rolled down the window a crack to let some cold air in, and that's when I realized how completely alone I was out there. No houses, no lights, nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. It should have been peaceful, but something about the emptiness made my skin prickle. I told myself it was just the fatigue making me jumpy. I'd been sitting there maybe 5 minutes, eyes closed but not quite sleeping, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My eyes snapped open and I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see another car pulling in to do the same thing I was doing. But what I saw made my gut tighten. A dark sedan, maybe a Chevy or Ford, had parked about 30 feet behind me at an angle, nose pointed toward the highway like it was ready to leave quickly. The headlights were off, completely off. And whoever was inside wasn't getting out or doing anything, just sitting there in the darkness. I sat up straighter, suddenly very awake, and watched the mirror. The car didn't move. Nobody emerged. It just sat there, this black shape barely visible against the night sky, and every instinct I had started screaming that this wasn't right. I reached for my phone before remembering it was dead, which sent a fresh wave of anxiety through my chest. My keys were still in the ignition and I slowly wrapped my fingers around them without making any sudden movements. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just someone else who needed a break. Or maybe they were lost and checking a map. But then why park so far back? Why keep the lights off? I kept my eyes on the mirror, barely breathing, and counted the seconds. 30 passed, then 60. The car still didn't move, and I couldn't see anyone inside because the windows were too dark. My training kicked in enough to make me assess the situation logically. One exit, blocked by the sedan. Open terrain on both sides, but my little Nissan sedan wasn't exactly built for off-roading through desert scrub. And if I started my engine now, whoever was back there would know I was spooked. Then the driver's door opened. I watched a figure step out, backlit by the dome light for just a second before it went dark again. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing what looked like jeans and a dark jacket, civilian clothes. The person closed the door quietly, too quietly, like they didn't want to make noise, and started walking toward my car. Not in a hurry, just this steady, purposeful walk that made my heart start hammering against my ribs. I sat perfectly still, my right hand still on my keys, my left reaching down to make sure my door was locked. It was. The figure kept coming, and as they got closer I could make out more details in my side mirror. White guy, maybe in his 40s, with short hair and a square jaw. Something about the way he moved was too controlled, too deliberate. When he got within 10 feet of my driver's side window, he raised his hand and knocked on the glass. 3 sharp raps that made me jump despite trying to stay calm. I cracked the window maybe an inch, just enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach through. "Can I help you?" My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I was grateful for that. The man leaned down slightly, and in the dim glow from my dashboard, I could see his face clearly now. Clean-shaven, hard eyes, the kind of expression that gave away nothing. "Military police," he said, his tone flat and official. "Need to see your identification and registration." My brain stuttered for a second. Military police, out here, in civilian clothes, in an unmarked car with the lights off? Nothing about this made sense. Real MPs drove marked vehicles, wore uniforms or at least had visible badges, and they sure as hell didn't lurk in highway turnouts at midnight waiting for random soldiers. "Can I see your credentials?" I asked, keeping my voice level but firm. I'd been stopped by actual MPs before, and they always showed ID first. The man straightened up, and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "Wait here," he said, then turned and started walking back toward his car. But he didn't walk like someone going to get identification. He walked like someone who'd just had their bluff called. My pulse was racing now, and I watched him in the mirror as he got about halfway back to the sedan. Then he stopped, pulled something from his pocket that looked like a phone, and appeared to be texting or calling someone. That's when I saw the headlights. A second vehicle, a large SUV or truck, came rolling up the highway with its high beams off, just running lights, and it slowed down as it approached the turnout. My entire body went cold. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. The SUV pulled in behind the sedan, completely blocking the only exit back onto the highway, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was in serious danger. I didn't wait to see who got out of the second vehicle. My hand twisted the key and the engine roared to life, way too loud in the silent night. The man who'd knocked on my window spun around and started running back toward me, yelling something I couldn't hear over the blood pounding in my ears. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, toward the open desert, and stomped on the gas. My car lurched forward, tires spinning in the gravel before catching, and I went straight off the edge of the turnout into the scrub brush. The suspension screamed as I hit the uneven ground, sagebrush scraping the undercarriage with sounds like nails on metal. My headlights bounced wildly, illuminating nothing but dirt and rocks and scattered vegetation. Behind me, I could see lights now. Both vehicles had their high beams on, and at least one of them was trying to follow me into the brush. But my car was smaller, lighter, and I was running on pure adrenaline and terror. I kept the gas pedal floored, steering around the bigger rocks and praying I didn't hit a drainage ditch or blow a tire. The terrain sloped upwards slightly, and my little sedan struggled, engine whining, but I kept pushing it. After what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, I saw the highway again, the northbound lane about 50 yards ahead. I aimed for it, crashed through a final stretch of low brush, and my tires hit pavement with a screech that probably took years off the rubber. I didn't slow down. I merged onto the highway going 60 and kept accelerating, checking my rear view obsessively. The lights behind me had stopped at the edge of the brush. They weren't following onto the road. I drove for another 10 miles before my hands started shaking so badly I had to pull into a gas station just to breathe. The attendant inside looked at me like I'd seen a ghost, which I guess wasn't far from the truth. I borrowed his phone and called the local police, told them everything while sitting under the fluorescent lights with a bottle of water I couldn't even open because my hands wouldn't work right. The dispatcher took my information, told me a unit would meet me there and asked if I needed medical attention. I said no, but honestly, I wasn't sure. 2 sheriff's deputies showed up 20 minutes later and I walked them through the whole thing again. They took notes, asked good questions, seemed to take it seriously. One of them mentioned they'd had reports of suspicious activity along that stretch of highway, people getting followed or hassled, but nothing quite like what I described. They offered to escort me home, which I accepted without hesitation. I filed a formal report the next morning at the station, gave them every detail I could remember about the sedan and the SUV, though I hadn't caught any plate numbers in the chaos. What happened next is the part that still keeps me up sometimes. 2 days later, a detective called me. They'd found a burned-out vehicle at that exact turnout, completely torched, nothing left but a blackened frame and melted metal. The fire department had responded to it Sunday morning after a trucker reported smoke. When investigators sifted through the wreckage, they found military gear in the trunk, stuff that had survived the fire enough to be identifiable. Tactical vests, what looked like parts of uniforms, equipment that absolutely should not have been in some random civilian's car. The detective said they were treating it as connected to my incident, possibly part of a theft ring targeting military personnel or installations. He told me I'd made the right call running, that these people were clearly professionals who knew what they were doing. They never caught whoever was driving those vehicles, and I never found out if that gear was stolen from Post or from someone like me. The case went cold after a few months. I take a different route home now, even though it adds 15 minutes to the drive. I never stop on highways anymore, no matter how tired I get, and I keep my phone charged religiously. Sometimes I think about how close I came to rolling down that window further, or waiting longer before running, or any number of small decisions that could have changed everything. The detective told me that whoever they were, they'd clearly done this before, that the coordinated approach and the fake MP angle suggested experience. What bothers me most isn't even the danger I was in, though that's bad enough. It's knowing they're still out there somewhere, maybe still working that same stretch of road, maybe targeting other soldiers who are too tired or trusting to question things. I reported every detail I could remember to both the local police and my chain of command, even sat down with CID investigators who wanted to know if I'd noticed anything suspicious on Post in the weeks before. They seemed to think these people had inside knowledge, knew schedules or patterns. I deployed 4 months after all this happened, and honestly, being overseas felt safer than driving that highway. When I got back stateside last year, the first thing I did was check if there'd been any updates on the case. There hadn't been. No arrests, no new leads, just my statement and that burned car sitting in an evidence lot somewhere. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd been too exhausted to question that fake badge, or if my car hadn't made it through that terrain. Some nights I wake up hearing those 3 sharp knocks on glass, and I have to remind myself I made it out. Not everyone might have been that lucky. Someone asked me to share what happened during my time at Fort Hood, and honestly, I still get this weird feeling in my chest when I think about it. I'd been working as a logistics coordinator for about 18 months when this all went down. One of those jobs where you're basically shuffling supplies and paperwork while pretending the coffee hasn't gone cold for the 3rd time that shift. The apartment complex where I lived sat about 2 miles from the main gate, one of those places that catered specifically to enlisted folks who wanted to get away from the barracks but couldn't afford anything fancy. My unit was on the 2nd floor, number 214, facing the parking lot where I could see my beat-up Mazda from the kitchen window. The place had that generic rental smell, like industrial carpet cleaner mixed with whoever lived there before, but it was mine, and I'd made it comfortable with some plants and posters that made the beige walls less depressing. The first time I noticed something wrong was on a Wednesday in late January. I just finished a graveyard shift that had me processing inventory reports until my eyes felt like sandpaper. And when I trudged up the stairs to my apartment around 7 in the morning, I could have sworn the door wasn't quite flush with the frame. Not wide open or anything obvious, just that tiny gap where you could see a sliver of darkness inside instead of the door sitting properly in its frame. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, my work bag hanging off one shoulder, trying to remember if I'd been in such a rush the night before that I hadn't pulled it shut completely. The lock had clicked when I left. I was pretty sure of that, but exhaustion has a way of making you doubt your own memory. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find my stuff ransacked or my cat freaking out, but everything looked exactly how I'd left it. The dishes were still in the sink, my boots by the door, the throw blanket on the couch in the same wrinkled heap. I checked every room, every closet, even looked under the bed like some paranoid kid. But there was nothing. No broken windows, no missing valuables, nothing that would explain why my door hadn't been properly closed. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just tired and seeing problems where there weren't any. But then it happened again the following week. Same scenario. Night shift. Came home to find that same tiny gap between the door and frame, like someone had pulled it almost closed but not quite hard enough for the latch to catch. This time I was sure I'd locked it properly because I specifically remembered jiggling the handle twice before heading to my car, something I'd started doing after the first incident. My neighbor across the hall, this guy named Kevin who worked in transportation, was getting his newspaper when I came up the stairs. He gave me this casual wave and I almost asked him if he'd seen anyone near my door, but the words felt stupid in my mouth. What was I going to say, that my door wasn't closing right? That I thought someone might be coming into my apartment but leaving everything exactly as it was? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, like the plot of some bad thriller where the woman is just being hysterical. But here's the thing that really got under my skin. I started noticing these tiny differences that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. My bathroom towel would be hanging slightly crooked when I was obsessive about keeping it straight. The chair at my kitchen table would be pulled out a few inches when I always pushed it in. One morning I found my bedroom closet door open maybe 6 inches, and I never left it open because the squeaky hinge annoyed me. These weren't big disruptions, nothing you could point to and say definitively that someone had been there, but they were enough to make me feel like my space was being violated in some subtle, creeping way. I started taking pictures of my apartment before I left for work, stupid little snapshots of how I arranged things, just so I could compare when I got back. My coworker Dana thought I was losing it when I mentioned feeling weird about my place, said maybe the cleaning staff had a key and was coming in without telling me. Except we didn't have cleaning staff at that complex, and I sure as hell wasn't paying for any service like that. The 3rd week of February, I decided to do something about it instead of just sitting there feeling creeped out. I went down to the apartment office and talked to the property manager, this older woman named Diane, who had that permanent look of someone dealing with complaints all day. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, tried not to sound like I was accusing anyone of anything, just said I was concerned about my lock maybe being faulty. She pulled up my file on her computer, tapping her nails on the desk while she scrolled, and told me that my unit had been keyed with a digital access system that was supposedly more secure than traditional locks. Each resident got a key card that was programmed specifically for their unit, and the system kept a log of every entry. She said if I was really worried, she could request the access logs from the past month, but it would take a few days to pull together. I told her yes, absolutely. I wanted to see those logs. Something in my voice must have convinced her I wasn't just being paranoid, because she made a note in her computer and said she'd have them by the end of the week. Those next few days were torture. I couldn't focus at work, kept checking my phone every 10 minutes like the logs were going to magically appear in my email. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked from the inside, even though that felt insane, because who locks their bedroom door in their own apartment? But I couldn't shake this feeling that someone had been in my space, touching my things, standing in my kitchen while I was gone. I even bought one of those cheap doorstop alarms from the store on base, the kind that screams if someone tries to open the door while you're inside. My cat absolutely hated the thing, nearly gave herself a heart attack the first time she brushed against it, and set it off. When Friday finally rolled around, I practically ran to the office during my lunch break. Diane had the printout waiting for me in a manila folder, and the look on her face told me she'd already read through it. She slid it across the desk and said there were some entries that didn't match up with when I said I was home, and that she'd already contacted the main office about it. I opened that folder right there at her desk, and my hands were shaking so bad the pages rattled. The log showed my keycard entries, all the times I'd come and gone, which matched up with my memory perfectly. But there were other entries too, marked with a different card number, happening in the early morning hours when I was at work. Someone had accessed my apartment 7 times over the past month. 7 times. Always between 3 and 5 in the morning. Always when they somehow knew I wouldn't be there. The entries were time-stamped down to the minute. February 2nd at 4:18 in the morning, stayed for 42 minutes. February 9th at 3:30, stayed for an hour and 12 minutes. The most recent one was just 3 days ago. I felt this wave of nausea hit me so hard I thought I might throw up right there on Diane's desk. Someone had been in my home, in my bedroom, going through my things while I was working night shift. The violation of it made my skin feel wrong, like I needed to peel it off and start over. Diane called the police right then, didn't even ask if I wanted to file a report, just picked up her phone and dialed. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes, a younger guy and an older woman who had this no-nonsense attitude that actually made me feel a little better. They took my statement, photographed the access logs, and explained that they'd need to pull security footage from the complex's cameras. The property had cameras in the parking lot and near the main entrance, supposedly for resident safety, though I'd never paid much attention to them before. The female officer, her name tag said Phillips, told me they'd also need to figure out whose keycard was being used to access my unit. Each card had a unique identifier in the system, so it wasn't anonymous. Someone specific had that card, and the system would tell them exactly who it had been issued to. She asked me if I had any ex-boyfriends or anyone who might have a reason to want access to my place, and I told her no, nobody like that. I'd been single for over a year and kept mostly to myself outside of work. It took them 3 days to trace the keycard, and those were the longest 3 days of my life. I stayed with Dana during that time, sleeping on her couch because there was no way in hell I was going back to my apartment alone. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. The police had advised me not to change my routine too drastically because they wanted to see if the person would try to access the unit again, maybe catch him on camera or even in the act, but I couldn't stomach the idea of being bait. When Officer Phillips finally called me, her voice had this edge to it that made my chest tighten before she even said anything. The keycard belonged to a guy named Adrian Sutton, former Army specialist who'd been discharged 2 years prior. He'd lived in my exact apartment, Unit 214, from 2013 to 2015 before moving off to some other assignment. When he'd left, he was supposed to turn in his keycard to the office, standard procedure, but apparently he'd reported it lost, and they'd just deactivated it in the system and issued him a replacement for the checkout process. Except the deactivation never actually went through. Some kind of clerical error, a box that didn't get checked in the computer, and his old card stayed active in the system all this time. The security footage was worse than I could have imagined. The officers showed me clips on a laptop at the station, and I had to watch this man, this complete stranger, walking up to my building in regular jeans and a jacket like he belonged there. He knew exactly where the cameras were positioned because he'd lived there, so he kept his head down, ball cap pulled low, but they got enough of his face to confirm it was Sutton. The footage showed him swiping the card at my door, glancing around once to make sure no one was in the hallway, then slipping inside. He stayed in there for over an hour on the clip they showed me. When he came out, he was carrying nothing, hands in his pockets, casual as anything. Officer Phillips explained that they'd already been to his current address, a rental house about 15 miles away, and when they searched the place, they found items belonging to 3 other women: jewelry, clothing, photographs, even a journal that wasn't his. Turns out I wasn't his only victim. He'd been doing this to multiple women in different apartment complexes around the base, all places where he'd previously lived or had some connection to. He had a whole system, kept spreadsheets on his computer tracking which units he could access, and when the residents worked night shifts, they arrested him that same day, charged him with multiple counts of burglary, stalking, and trespassing. The detective assigned to the case told me that Sutton had been exploiting security gaps in the housing system for at least 18 months, maybe longer. He'd figured out that when people moved out of base housing, the deactivation process wasn't always followed through properly, especially in older apartment complexes with outdated management software. He'd test old key cards periodically to see which ones still worked. Then he'd research who lived in those units now, figure out their schedules through social media or just by watching the parking lot. The whole thing was so calculated and predatory that it made me feel sick. What really got me was that he'd taken almost nothing from my apartment. A few photos from my phone that I'd printed out and kept on my fridge, one of my old PT shirts that I thought I'd just misplaced. He wasn't robbing people in the traditional sense. He was collecting pieces of their lives, souvenirs, like we were trophies or something. Officer Phillips said he'd probably been building up to something worse, that stalkers like him usually escalate over time. The apartment complex terminated my lease without penalty and helped me move to a different unit in another building, one with a completely new key card system and updated locks. They also had to notify every single resident about the security breach and reissue all the key cards in the entire complex, which caused this massive headache for everyone, but was absolutely necessary. Sutton ended up pleading guilty to avoid trial, got sentenced to 6 years in prison plus probation, and a restraining order against all his victims. I had to go to court twice, once for the preliminary hearing and once for sentencing, and seeing him sitting there in an orange jumpsuit with this blank expression on his face made me realize he didn't even see us as real people. We were just accessible, just targets. I still live near Fort Hood, different complex now, but I check my door 3 times before I leave, and I have a security camera inside my apartment that sends alerts to my phone. Some people think I'm paranoid, but they weren't the ones who had a stranger spending hours in their bedroom going through their things. Dana tells me I should move somewhere completely different, start fresh, but honestly, I refuse to let that creep run me out of my life. I earned my place here and he's the one locked up, not me. When I started volunteering for the Veterans Oral History Project, I thought it would be mostly paperwork and camera setups. I wasn't a historian, just a part-time technician helping record interviews for the archive. The goal was simple: capture the stories of service members before time, and silence swallowed them. Most sessions went the same way: polite introductions, some nervous laughter, and long pauses between memories. Then one afternoon, they sent me the file of a man named Elliot Marsh. His record showed a clean discharge and a few commendations. Nothing unusual. He arrived exactly on time, dressed neatly, his posture too rigid for someone who'd been out of uniform for years. He spoke softly but carried that kind of discipline you don't unlearn. At first, it was standard stuff: base life, desert heat, patrols that blurred together. His words came steady, measured, the kind of rhythm you get when you've told the same stories to family gatherings. But about 20 minutes in, something in his voice changed, a hesitation that didn't match the rest. He glanced toward the camera light, then at me, and asked if the recording was secure. I told him yes, standard digital capture, local backup, nothing special. He nodded but didn't seem convinced. Then, out of nowhere, he said there was one mission that never made it into any report. His expression tightened, and he pressed his palms flat on the table as if steadying himself. "They told us it was a rescue," he said, "but that's not what it turned into." The air in the room shifted after that. He described a night operation deep in an unnamed valley. No coordinates, no date. His unit was ordered to secure a group of civilians supposedly linked to insurgents. But when they arrived, there were no weapons, no defenses, just a cluster of families huddled near burned-out vehicles. He said they were told to wait for extraction, but no one came. Hours passed, and the radio stayed silent. Then, without command, half his squad vanished into the dark. Elliot's eyes drifted toward the corner of the room as he talked, like he was tracking something only he could see. His breathing got uneven, and his tone lowered almost to a whisper. He said the people they were guarding didn't speak, didn't move much, and didn't seem afraid. One of the civilians, a woman in a torn blue scarf, kept looking past them, over their shoulders, as if waiting for someone else to arrive. He said when dawn came, the sun hit the valley wrong. The ground looked black like wet glass, and none of the missing soldiers were ever found. I remember trying to ask clarifying questions, to keep the session professional, but the words stuck. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, charged. He rubbed his temples and said that later, during roll call, they'd still heard voices answering back, names belonging to those who'd disappeared. He laughed nervously and said he still hears them sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep. Then he went silent, staring down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, and his nails dug into his palms until I thought he might break the skin. I stopped the camera for a minute and asked if he wanted to take a break. He didn't respond, just sat there, breathing slow, eyes darting from the window to the wall behind me. After a while, he said something I couldn't make sense of, that the faces he saw back then still reported in, like they were waiting for orders. I turned the camera back on, but he seemed distant now, detached from the present. His words came fragmented, disjointed, half sentences swallowed by long pauses. Then, all at once, he leaned forward and whispered, "They still think it's nighttime." His voice cracked when he said it. I tried to ask what he meant, but before I could finish, he stood up and walked out of frame. The door didn't close. It just creaked slowly until the room was empty on screen. I thought maybe he needed air, so I gave him a minute. When I finally stepped into the hall, there was no sign of him. His jacket still hung on the chair, his folder on the table, but the corridor outside was completely empty. Security searched the building, every office and stairwell, but no one saw him leave. The entrance camera never picked him up either. It was as if he'd vanished between frames. I filed a report, filled out every box I could, and left a note on the archive log explaining that the interview had ended abruptly. The rest of that evening is a blur. I remember locking the storage room myself, sealing the tape, and trying to convince myself that he'd just walked out quietly and slipped past the cameras somehow. A few days later, I came back to process the footage. The file was still labeled Marsh Elliott, Interview A. It played normally at first, and the introductions, the small talk, everything exactly as I remembered. Then right where he leaned forward and whispered that last sentence, the image warped. His face blurred, and the sound distorted into static. The recording cut off mid-word. After that, there was a few seconds of darkness, and then a slow, rhythmic breathing close to the mic. Not his voice, not mine. I checked the system logs thinking maybe someone tampered with the file, but there was no sign of access. The room had been locked since that day. The tape was supposed to be stored offline, but somehow it showed a new timestamp. The night before I reviewed it. I didn't tell anyone. I just made a copy of the footage and kept it hidden at home, unsure if I'd ever be able to explain it. Every few months, the archive asks if I want to resume interviews, and I always find a reason to decline. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I play that last section with the volume all the way up. You can hear faint voices under the breathing. Quiet, clipped, like names being called one after another. I've compared them to his transcript. They match the names of the soldiers he said were gone. The original file is still stored in the project's cold archive, labeled as incomplete, but I've stopped checking it. Some stories I think aren't meant to be preserved. I'd been driving cross-country for work that summer, doing maintenance checks on comms equipment for different Army bases. Most nights I slept in the truck, but that day had been long and brutally hot, so when I saw a flickering vacancy sign near the edge of a small base town, I decided to stop. The place was called the Pines Motel, though there weren't any pine trees anywhere nearby. just scrub grass and a cracked parking lot. The guy at the counter looked like he'd been carved out of old leather, buzz cut and sunburned cheeks, the kind of posture that doesn't go away even after you hang up the uniform. He introduced himself as Rick, said he used to be military police back in his day. "I give discounts to anyone who's ever worn a patch," he joked, tapping the counter with a grin. His stories came quick, about patrols overseas, long deployments, and kids these days who didn't know what discipline was. He seemed harmless enough, maybe a little too eager to talk, but I'd met plenty of retired guys like him. I signed the logbook, got my key, and headed to room 4, the one closest to the end of the row. The room smelled faintly of bleach and air freshener, but it was clean. Old floral curtains, buzzing neon leaking through the window, a TV bolted to the dresser with a cracked remote. I showered, grabbed a soda from the vending machine outside, and sat out front on one of the plastic chairs while the sun went down. Rick came by again, carrying a clipboard, and started chatting about how he liked to keep an eye on things, since the base traffic kept the area busy. He asked what kind of work I did, where I was headed, and whether I'd been stationed nearby before. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on my truck longer than seemed normal. Later that night, around 11, I noticed something strange. From the bed, I could see a faint red light blinking near the vent above the door. At first, I figured it was a smoke detector, but when I stood on the chair to check, it looked more like a small lens embedded into the plastic grill. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe an old security sensor. But the idea stuck in my head, heavy and uneasy. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Rick was already outside sweeping the walkway when I stepped out. He greeted me like we were old friends, offered coffee from a thermos, and asked if I'd slept all right. I lied and said I had. He mentioned he was running the place mostly for the boys passing through, meaning soldiers from the nearby base who needed a cheap night between transfers. He even bragged about keeping the rates lower than the chains in town, because they deserve a break. It all sounded generous on the surface, but something about how rehearsed it felt made me uneasy. While packing my gear, I noticed faint scratches around the base of the mirror near the bathroom door, like someone had tried to pry it off with a screwdriver. Behind it, there was a subtle hum, mechanical, low, almost like wiring behind the wall. I leaned closer but stopped when the front door creaked open. Rick stood there holding a towel, smiling. Said he was just checking if I needed extras for the road. I thanked him and locked the door as soon as he left. The hum behind the mirror seemed louder after that. I checked out around 10, drove to a diner near the highway, and couldn't shake the feeling that I'd dodged something. When the waitress asked where I'd stayed, I mentioned the Pines. Her face went still. She said she thought that place had shut down months ago. Claimed the property had been condemned for code violations. No running water, electrical hazards, the works. But I'd just been there less than an hour earlier. When I insisted it was open, she just stared at me and said, "Honey, nobody's supposed to be living out there." I called the local sheriff's office that afternoon to ask about it, figuring maybe Rick was running it off the books. The deputy on the line asked for my name and told me to stay where I was. Within 30 minutes, 2 officers showed up at the diner, took my statement, and asked me to describe the man. When I said his name was Rick, one of them exchanged a look with the other. They didn't tell me much, just that they'd been looking for him for a while. They asked if I still had my room key. I did, and they took it as evidence. 2 days later, an investigator called to follow up. He said they'd gone to the property early that morning and found the entire motel empty. Doors unlocked, office ransacked, lights still on. The basement door had been forced open, and inside were signs of something worse. There were faint blood traces along the drain and wiring that ran from the ceiling, down through a mess of disconnected monitors. Every guest room had hidden cameras disguised as vents, mirrors, even wall hooks. Most of them were wired to a central system in the basement. The man I'd met, Rick, was gone. The investigator explained that several missing soldiers had last been traced to the same stretch of road over the past year. Most were young, just traveling through between assignments. Their names showed up in the motel's handwritten logbook, the same one I'd signed. When authorities compared it with records from nearby bases, none of those men had ever checked in at their next destinations. Rick's real name wasn't Rick at all. It belonged to a retired military police officer who'd left service under investigation for misconduct years earlier. They suspected he'd been luring young servicemen by offering discounts, then drugging them. What happened after, nobody could say for sure. The blood evidence was partial, not enough for confirmation, and there were no bodies, only fragments of uniforms, scraps of tape, and boot soles buried behind the property. The agent told me they believed he'd fled the state within hours of me leaving that morning. My report was the last confirmed encounter anyone had with him. It's been years since then, and I still think about that night every time I pass a small roadside motel. I keep wondering how many people smiled back at that same man, handed him cash, and went to sleep under those same vents. Sometimes I wake up on the road and glance around, half expecting to see that faint red light blinking somewhere in the dark. I never stayed at another mom-and-pop place again, not after the Pines. Some things you can't unsee, even if you only saw them once.